History of New York by Washington Irving. Book 1. Book 1. Containing diverse ingenious theories and philosophic speculations concerning the creation and population of the world, as connected with the history of New York. Chapter 1. According to the best authorities, the world in which we dwell is a huge, opaque, reflecting, inanimate mass, floating in the vast ethereal ocean of infinite space. It has the form of an orange, being an oblate spheroid, curiously flattened at opposite parts, for the insertion of two imaginary poles, which are supposed to penetrate and unite at the center, thus forming an axis on which the mighty orange turns with a regular diurnal revolution. The transitions of light and darkness, whence proceed the alternations of day and night, are produced by this diurnal revolution, successively presenting the different parts of the earth to the rays of the sun. The latter is, according to the best, that is to say, the latest, accounts a luminous or fiery body, of a prodigious magnitude, from which this world is driven by a centrifugal or repelling power, and to which it is drawn by a centripetal or attractive force, otherwise called the attraction of gravitation, the combination, or rather the counteraction, of these two opposing impulses producing a circular and annual revolution. Hence result the different seasons of the year, viz. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter. This I believe to be the most approved modern theory on the subject, though there be many philosophers who have entertained very different opinions. Some, too, of them entitled to much deference from their great antiquity and illustrious characters. Thus it was advanced by some of the ancient sages that the earth was an extended plain, supported by vast pillars, and by others that it rested on the head of a snake or the back of a huge tortoise. But as they did not provide a resting place for either the pillars or the tortoise, the whole theory fell to the ground for want of proper foundation. The Brahmins assert that the heavens rest upon the earth, and the sun and moon swim therein like fishes in the water, moving from east to west by day, and gliding along the edge of the horizon to their original stations during the night, wink with a frown too, while, according to the Puranicas of India, it is a vast plain, encircled by 7 oceans of mild, nectar, and other delicious liquids, that it is studded with 7 mountains, and ornamented in the center by a mountainous rock of burnished gold, and that a great dragon occasionally swallows up the moon, which accounts for the phenomena of lunar eclipses. 3. Beside these, and many other equally sage opinions, we have the profound conjectures of Abul Hasan Ali, son of Al-Khan, son of Ali, son of Abderrahman, son of Abdallah, son of Masud el-Hadhili, who is commonly called Masudi and surnamed Kothbedin, but who takes the humble title of Lahebi Rasul, which means the companion of the ambassador of God. He has written a universal history, entitled Murujed Darab, or the Golden Meadows, and the Mines of Precious Stones. For in this valuable work he has related the history of the world, from the creation down to the moment of writing, which was under the Caliphate of Mothi-Billah, in the month Jumumadi al-Awwal of the 336th year of the Hijra, or flight of the Prophet. He informs us that the earth is a huge bird, Mecca and Medina constitute the head, Persia and India the right wing, the land of Gog the left wing, and Africa the tail. He informs us, moreover, that an earth has existed before the present, which he considers as a mere chicken of 7,000 years, that it has undergone diverse deluges, and that, according to the opinion of some well-informed Brahmins of his acquaintance, it will be renovated every 70,000th Hazaruam, each Hazaruam consisting of 12,000 years. These are a few of the many contradictory opinions of philosophers concerning the earth, and we find that the learned have had equal perplexity as to the nature of the sun. Some of the ancient philosophers have affirmed that it is a vast wheel of brilliant fire, wink with a frown 5, others that it is merely a mirror or sphere of transparent crystal, wink with a frown 6, and a third class, at the head of whom stands Anaxagoras, maintained that it was nothing but a huge ignited mass of iron or stone. Indeed, he declared the heavens to be merely a vault of stone, and that the stars were stones whirled upward from the earth, and set on fire by the velocity of its revolutions. 7. But I give little attention to the doctrines of this philosopher, the people of Athens having fully refuted them by banishing him from their city. A concise mode of answering unwelcome doctrines, much resorted to in former days. Another sect of philosophers do declare that certain fiery particles exhale constantly from the earth, which, concentrating in a single point of the firmament by day, constitute the sun, but being scattered and rambling about in the dark at night, collect in various points and form stars. These are regularly burnt out and extinguished, not unlike to the lamps in our streets, and require a fresh supply of exhalations for the next occasion. 8. It is even recorded that at certain remote and obscure periods, in consequence of a great scarcity of fuel, the sun has been completely burnt out, and sometimes not rekindled for a month at a time. A most melancholy circumstance, the very idea of which gave vast concern to Heraclitus, that worthy weeping philosopher of antiquity. In addition to these various speculations, it was the opinion of Herschel that the sun is a magnificent, habitable abode, the light it furnishes arising from certain imperial, luminous, or phosphoric clouds, swimming in its transparent atmosphere. 9. But we will not enter further at present into the nature of the sun, that being an inquiry not immediately necessary to the development of this history. Neither will we embroil ourselves in any more of the endless disputes of philosophers touching the form of this globe, but content ourselves with the theory advanced in the beginning of this chapter, and will proceed to illustrate by experiment the complexity of motion therein described to this our rotatory planet. Professor von Poddingcoft, or Puddinghead, as the name may be rendered into English, was long celebrated in the University of Leiden for profound gravity of deportment and a talent at going to sleep in the midst of examinations, to the infinite relief of his hopeful students, who thereby worked their way through college with great ease and little study. In the course of one of his lectures, the learned professor, seizing a bucket of water, swung it around his head at arm's length. The impulse with which he threw the vessel from him, being a centrifugal force, the retention of his arm operating as a centripetal power, and the bucket, which was a substitute for the earth, describing a circular orbit round about the globular head and ruby visage of Professor von Poddingcoft, which formed no bad representation of the sun. All of these particulars were duly explained to the class of gaping students around him. He apprised them, moreover, that the same principle of gravitation which retained the water in the bucket restrains the ocean from flying from the earth in its rapid revolutions, and he farther informed them that should the motion of the earth be suddenly checked, it would incontinently fall into the sun, through the centripetal force of gravitation. A most ruinous event to this planet, and one which would also obscure, though it most probably would not extinguish, the solar luminary. An unlucky stripling, one of those vagrant geniuses who seem sent into the world merely to annoy worthy men of the Puddinghead order, desirous of ascertaining the correctness of the experiment, suddenly arrested the arm of the professor just at the moment that the bucket was in its zenith, which immediately descended with astonishing precision upon the philosophic head of the instructor of youth. A hollow sound and a red-hot hiss attended the contact. But the theory was in the amplest manner illustrated, for the unfortunate bucket perished in the conflict. But the blazing countenance of Professor von Poddingcoft emerged from amidst the waters, glowing fiercer than ever with unutterable indignation, whereby the students were marvelously edified, and departed considerably wiser than before. It is a mortifying circumstance, which greatly perplexes many a painstaking philosopher, that nature often refuses to second his most profound and elaborate efforts, so that often after having invented one of the most ingenious and natural theories imaginable, she will have the perverseness to act directly in the teeth of his system, and flatly contradict his most favorite positions. This is a manifest and unmerited grievance, since it throws the censure of the vulgar and unlearned entirely upon the philosopher, whereas the fault is not to be ascribed to his theory, which is unquestionably correct, but to the waywardness of Dame Nature, who, with the proverbial fickleness of her sex, is continually indulging in coquetries and caprices, and seems really to take pleasure in violating all philosophic rules, and jilting the most learned and indefatigable of her adorers. Thus it happened with respect to the foregoing satisfactory explanation of the motion of our planet. It appears that the centrifugal force has long since ceased to operate, while its antagonist remains in undiminished potency. The world, therefore, according to the theory as it originally stood, ought in strict propriety to tumble into the sun. Philosophers were convinced that it would do so, and awaited in anxious impatience the fulfillment of their prognostics. But the untoward planet pertinaciously continued her course, notwithstanding that she had reason, philosophy, and a whole university of learned professors opposed to her conduct. The philosophers took this in very ill part, and it is thought they would never have pardoned the slight and affront which they conceived put upon them by the world, had not a good-natured professor kindly officiated as a mediator between the parties, and effected a reconciliation. Finding the world would not accommodate itself to the theory, he wisely determined to accommodate the theory to the world. He therefore informed his brother philosophers that the circular motion of the earth round the sun was no sooner engendered by the conflicting impulses above described than it became a regular revolution independent of the cause which gave it origin. His learned brethren readily joined in the opinion, being heartily glad of any explanation that would decently extricate them from their embarrassment. And ever since that memorable era the world has been left to take her own course, and to revolve around the sun in such orbit as she thinks proper. Chapter 2. Having thus briefly introduced my reader to the world, and given him some idea of its form and situation, he will naturally be curious to know from whence it came, and how it was created. And, indeed, the clearing up of these points is absolutely essential to my history, inasmuch as if this world had not been formed, it is more than probable that this renowned island, on which is situated the city of New York, would never have had an existence. The regular course of my history, therefore, requires that I should proceed to notice the cosmogony or formation of this our globe. And now I give my readers fair warning that I am about to plunge, for a chapter or two, into as complete a labyrinth as ever historian was perplexed withal. Therefore, I advise them to take fast hold of my skirts, and keep close at my heels, venturing neither to the right hand nor to the left, lest they get bemired in a slough of unintelligible learning, or have their brains knocked out by some of those hard Greek names which will be flying about in all directions. But should any of them be too indolent or chicken-hearted to accompany me in this perilous undertaking, they had better take a short cut round, and wait for me at the beginning of some smoother chapter. Of the creation of the world we have 1,000 contradictory accounts, and though a very satisfactory one is furnished us by divine revelation, yet every philosopher feels himself in honor bound to furnish us with a better. As an impartial historian, I consider it my duty to notice their several theories, by which mankind have been so exceedingly edified and instructed. Thus it was the opinion of certain ancient sages, that the earth and the whole system of the universe was the deity himself, a doctrine most strenuously maintained by Xenophanes and the whole tribe of Eleatics, as also by Strabo and the sect of peripatetic philosophers. Pythagoras likewise inculcated the famous numerical system of the monad, dyad, and triad, and by means of his sacred quaternary, elucidated the formation of the world, the arcana of nature, and the principles both of music and morals. Other sages adhered to the mathematical system of squares and triangles, the cube, the pyramid, and the sphere, the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron, while others advocated the great elementary theory, which refers the construction of our globe and all that it contains to the combinations of 4 material elements, air, earth, fire, and water, with the assistance of a 5th and immaterial and vivifying principle. Nor must I omit to mention the great atomic system taught by old Moschus before the siege of Troy, revived by Democritus of laughing memory, improved by Epicurus, that king of good fellows, and modernized by the fanciful Descartes. But I decline inquiring whether the atoms of which the earth is said to be composed are eternal or recent, whether they are animate or inanimate, whether, agreeably to the opinion of atheists, they were fortuitously aggregated, or, as the theists maintain, were arranged by a supreme intelligence. Whether, in fact, the earth be an insensate clod, or whether it be animated by a soul, which opinion was strenuously maintained by a host of philosophers, at the head of whom stands the great Plato, that temperate sage, who threw the cold water of philosophy on the form of sexual intercourse, and inculcated the doctrine of Platonic love, an exquisitely refined intercourse, but much better adapted to the ideal inhabitants of his imaginary island of Atlantis than to the sturdy race, composed of rebellious flesh and blood, which populates the little matter-of-fact island we inhabit. Besides these systems, we have, moreover, the poetical theogony of old Hesiod, who generated the whole universe in the regular mode of procreation, and the plausible opinion of others that the earth was hatched from the great egg of night, which floated in chaos, and was cracked by the horns of the celestial bull. To illustrate this last doctrine, Burnet, in his theory of the earth, has favored us with an accurate drawing and description, both of the form and texture of this mundane egg, which is found to bear a marvelous resemblance to that of a goose. Such of my readers as take a proper interest in the origin of this our planet will be pleased to learn that the most profound sages of antiquity among the Egyptians, Chaldeans, Persians, Greeks, and Latins have alternately assisted at the hatching of this strange bird, and that their cacklings have been caught, and continued in different tones and inflections, from philosopher to philosopher unto the present day. But while briefly noticing long-celebrated systems of ancient sages, Let me not pass over, with neglect, those of other philosophers, which, though less universal than renowned, have equal claims to attention and equal chance for correctness. Thus it is recorded by the Brahmins in the pages of their inspired Shasta, that the angel Vishnu transformed himself into a great boar, plunged into the watery abyss, and brought up the earth on his tusks. Then issued from him a mighty tortoise and a mighty snake, and Vishnu placed the snake erect upon the back of the tortoise, and he placed the earth upon the head of the snake. The Negro philosophers of Congo affirm that the world was made by the hands of angels, excepting their own country, which the Supreme Being constructed himself that it might be supremely excellent. And he took great pains with the inhabitants, and made them very black and beautiful. And when he had finished the first man, he was well pleased with him, and smoothed him over the face, and hence his nose, and the nose of all his descendants, became flat. The Mohawk philosophers tell us that a pregnant woman fell down from heaven, and that a tortoise took her upon its back, because every place was covered with water, and that the woman, sitting upon the tortoise, paddled with her hands in the water, and raked up the earth, whence it finally happened that the earth became higher than the water. But I forbear to quote a number more of these ancient and outlandish philosophers, whose deplorable ignorance, in despite of all their erudition, compelled them to write in languages which but few of my readers can understand, and I shall proceed briefly to notice a few more intelligible and fashionable theories of their modern successors. And, first, I shall mention the great Buffon, who conjectures that this globe was originally a globe of liquid fire, scintillated from the body of the sun, by the percussion of a comet, as a spark is generated by the collision of flint and steel. That at first it was surrounded by gross vapors, which, cooling and condensing in process of time, constituted, according to their densities, earth, water, and air, which gradually arranged themselves, according to their respective gravities, round the burning or vitrified mass that formed their center. Hutton, on the contrary, supposes that the waters at first were universally paramount, and he terrifies himself with the idea that the earth must be eventually washed away by the force of rain, rivers, and mountain torrents, until it is confounded with the ocean, or, in other words, absolutely dissolves into itself. Sublime idea, far surpassing that of the tender-hearted damsel of antiquity, who wept herself into a fountain, or the good dame of Narbonne in France, who, for a volubility of tongue unusual in her sex, was doomed to peel 500,039 ropes of onions, and actually run out at her eyes before half the hideous task was accomplished. Wistorn, the same ingenious philosopher who rivaled Ditton in his researches after the longitude, for which the mischief-loving Swift discharged on their heads a most savory stanza, has distinguished himself by a very admirable theory respecting the earth. He conjectures that it was originally a chaotic comet, which, being selected for the abode of man, was removed from its eccentric orbit, and whirled round the sun in its present regular motion, by which change of direction, order succeeded to confusion in the arrangement of its component parts. The philosopher adds that the deluge was produced by an uncourteous salute from the watery tail of another comet, doubtless through sheer envy of its improved condition, thus furnishing a melancholy proof that jealousy may prevail even among the heavenly bodies, and discord interrupt that celestial harmony of the spheres so melodiously sung by the poets. But I pass over a variety of excellent theories, among which are those of Burnet and Woodward and Whitehurst, regretting extremely that my time will not suffer me to give them the notice they deserve, and shall conclude with that of the renowned Dr. Darwin. This learned Theban, who is as much distinguished for rhyme as reason, and for good-natured credulity as serious research, and who has recommended himself wonderfully to the good graces of the ladies, by letting them into all the gallantries, amours, debaucheries, and other topics of scandal of the court of Flora, has fallen upon a theory worthy of his combustible imagination. According to his opinion, the huge mass of chaos took a sudden occasion to explode, like a barrel of gunpowder, and in that act exploded the sun, which, in its flight, by a similar convulsion, exploded the earth, which in like guise exploded the moon, and thus, by a concatenation of explosions, the whole solar system was produced, and set most systematically in motion. By the great variety of theories here alluded to, every one of which, if thoroughly examined, will be found surprisingly consistent in all its parts, my unlearned readers will perhaps be led to conclude that the creation of a world is not so difficult a task as they at first imagined. I have shown at least a score of ingenious methods in which a world could be constructed, and I have no doubt that had any of the philosophers above quoted the use of a good manageable comet, and the philosophical warehouse chaos at his command, he would engage to manufacture a planet as good, or, if you would take his word for it, better than this we inhabit. And here I cannot help noticing the kindness of Providence in creating comets for the great relief of bewildered philosophers. By their assistance, more sudden evolutions and transitions are effected in the system of nature than are wrought in a pantomimic exhibition by the wonder-working sword of Harlequin. Should one of our modern sages, in his theoretical flights among the stars, ever find himself lost in the clouds, and in danger of tumbling into the abyss of nonsense and absurdity, he has but to seize a comet by the beard, mount astride of its tail, and away he gallops in triumph like an enchanter on his hippogriff, or a Connecticut witch on her broomstick, to sweep the cobwebs out of the sky. It is an old and vulgar saying about a beggar on horseback which I would not for the world have applied to these reverend philosophers, but I must confess that some of them, when they are mounted on one of those fiery steeds, are as wild in their curvettings as was Phaeton of yore, when he aspired to manage the chariot of Phoebus. One drives his comet at full speed against the sun, and knocks the world out of him with the mighty concussion. Another, more moderate, makes his comet a kind of beast of burden, carrying the sun a regular supply of food and faggots. A third, of more combustible disposition, threatens to throw his comet like a bombshell into the world, and blow it up like a powder magazine, while a fourth, with no great delicacy to this planet and its inhabitants, insinuates that some day or other his comet, my modest pen blushes while I write it, shall absolutely turn tail upon our world and deluge it with water. Surely, as I have already observed, comets were bountifully provided by Providence for the benefit of philosophers to assist them in manufacturing theories. And now, having adduced several of the most prominent theories that occur to my recollection, I leave my judicious readers at full liberty to choose among them. They are all serious speculations of learned men, all differ essentially from each other, and all have the same title to belief. It has ever been the task of one race of philosophers to demolish the works of their predecessors, and elevate more splendid fantasies in their stead, which in their turn are demolished and replaced by the air castles of a succeeding generation. Thus it would seem that knowledge and genius, of which we make such great parade, consist but in detecting the errors and absurdities of those who have gone before, and devising new errors and absurdities, to be detected by those who are to come after us. Theories are the mighty soap bubbles with which the grown-up children of science amuse themselves while the honest vulgar stand gazing in stupid admiration, and dignify these learned vagaries with the name of wisdom. Surely Socrates was right in his opinion, that philosophers are but a soberer sort of madmen, busying themselves in things totally incomprehensible, or which, if they could be comprehended, would be found not worthy the trouble of discovery. For my own part, until the learned have come to an agreement among themselves, I shall content myself with the account handed down to us by Moses, in which I do but follow the example of our ingenious neighbors of Connecticut, who at their first settlement proclaimed that the colony should be governed by the laws of God, until they had time to make better. One thing, however, appears certain from the unanimous authority of the before-quoted philosophers, supported by the evidence of our own senses, which, though very apt to deceive us, may be cautiously admitted as additional testimony. It appears, I say, and I make the assertion deliberately, without fear of contradiction, that this globe really was created, and that it is composed of land and water. It further appears that it is curiously divided and parceled out into continents and islands, among which I boldly declare the renowned island of New York will be found by anyone who seeks for it in its proper place. Chapter 3. Noah, who is the first seafaring man we read of, begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japhet. Authors, it is true, are not wanting who affirm that the patriarch had a number of other children. Thus Berosus makes him father of the gigantic Titans. Methodius gives him a son called Jonithus, or Jonicus, who was the first inventor of Johnny cakes. And others have mentioned a son, named Thuiskin, from whom descended the Teutons or Teutonic, or, in other words, the Dutch nation. I regret exceedingly that the nature of my plan will not permit me to gratify the laudable curiosity of my readers, by investigating minutely the history of the great Noah. Indeed, such an undertaking would be attended with more trouble than many people would imagine, for the good old patriarch seems to have been a great traveler in his day, and to have passed under a different name in every country that he visited. The Chaldeans, for instance, give us his story, merely altering his name into Xisuthros, a trivial alteration, which to an historian skilled in etymologies will appear wholly unimportant. It appears, likewise, that he had exchanged his tarpaulin and quadrant among the Chaldeans for the gorgeous insignia of royalty, and appears as a monarch in their annals. The Egyptians celebrate him under the name of Osiris, the Indians as Menu, the Greek and Roman writers confound him with Ogyges, and the Theban with Deucalion and Saturn. But the Chinese, who deservedly rank among the most extensive and authentic historians, inasmuch as they have known the world much longer than anyone else, declare that Noah was no other than Fohi. And what gives this assertion some air of credibility is that it is a fact, admitted by the most enlightened literati, that Noah traveled into China at the time of the building of the Tower of Babel, probably to improve himself in the study of languages. And the learned Dr. Shuckford gives us the additional information that the ark rested on a mountain on the frontiers of China. From this mass of rational conjectures and sage hypotheses many satisfactory deductions might be drawn. But I shall content myself with the simple fact stated in the Bible, viz. that Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It is astonishing on what remote and obscure contingencies the great affairs of this world depend, and how events the most distant, and to the common observer unconnected, are inevitably consequent the one to the other. It remains to the philosopher to discover these mysterious affinities, and it is the proudest triumph of his skill to detect and drag forth some latent chain of causation, which at first sight appears a paradox to the inexperienced observer. Thus many of my readers will doubtless wonder what connection the family of Noah can possibly have with this history, and many will stare when informed that the whole history of this quarter of the world has taken its character and course from the simplest circumstance of the patriarchs having but 3 sons. But to explain. Noah, we are told by sundry very credible historians, becoming sole surviving heir and proprietor of the earth, in fee simple after the deluge, like a good father, portioned out his estate among his children. To Shem he gave Asia, to Ham Africa, and to Japheth Europe. Now it is 1,000 times to be lamented that he had but 3 sons, for had there been a 4th he would doubtless have inherited America, which, of course, would have been dragged forth from its obscurity on the occasion. And thus many a hard-working historian and philosopher would have been spared a prodigious mass of weary conjecture respecting the first discovery and population of this country. Noah, however, having provided for his 3 sons, looked in all probability upon our country as mere wild, unsettled land, and said nothing about it. And to this unpardonable taciturnity of the patriarch may we ascribe the misfortune that America did not come into the world as early as the other quarters of the globe. It is true, some writers have vindicated him from this misconduct towards posterity, and asserted that he really did discover America. Thus it was the opinion of Marc Lescarbot, a French writer, possessed of that ponderosity of thought and profoundness of reflection so peculiar to his nation, that the immediate descendants of Noah peopled this quarter of the globe, and that the old patriarch himself, who still retained a passion for the seafaring life, superintended the transmigration. The pious and enlightened father, Charlevoix, a French Jesuit, remarkable for his aversion to the marvelous, common to all great travelers, is conclusively of the same opinion. Nay, he goes still farther, and decides upon the manner in which the discovery was effected, which was by sea, and under the immediate direction of the great Noah. I have already observed, exclaims the good father in a tone of becoming indignation, that it is an arbitrary supposition that the grandchildren of Noah were not able to penetrate into the New World, or that they never thought of it. In effect, I can see no reason that can justify such a notion. Who can seriously believe that Noah and his immediate descendants knew less than we do, and that the builder and pilot of the greatest ship that ever was, a ship which was formed to traverse an unbounded ocean, and had so many shoals and quicksands to guard against, should be ignorant of, or should not have communicates to his descendants, the art of sailing on the ocean? Therefore they did sail on the ocean. Therefore they sailed to America. Therefore America was discovered by Noah. Now all this exquisite chain of reasoning, which is so strikingly characteristic of the good father, being addressed to the faith, rather than the understanding, is flatly opposed by Hans de Laet, who declares it a real and most ridiculous paradox to suppose that Noah ever entertained the thought of discovering America. And as Hans is a Dutch writer, I am inclined to believe he must have been much better acquainted with the worthy crew of the ark than his competitors, and of course possessed of more accurate sources of information. It is astonishing how intimate historians do daily become with the patriarchs and other great men of antiquity. As intimacy improves with time, and as the learned are particularly inquisitive and familiar in their acquaintance with the ancients, I should not be surprised if some future writers should gravely give us a picture of men and manners as they existed before the flood, far more copious and accurate than the Bible, and that, in the course of another century, the logbook of the good Noah should be as current among historians as the voyages of Captain Cook, or the renowned history of Robinson Crusoe. I shall not occupy my time by discussing the huge mass of additional suppositions, conjectures, and probabilities respecting the first discovery of this country, with which unhappy historians overload themselves in their endeavors to satisfy the doubts of an incredulous world. It is painful to see these laborious wights panting, and toiling, and sweating under an enormous burden, at the very outset of their works, which, on being opened, turns out to be nothing but a mighty bundle of straw. As, however, by unwearied assiduity, they seem to have established the fact, to the satisfaction of all the world, that this country has been discovered, I shall avail myself of their useful labors to be extremely brief upon this point. I shall not, therefore, stop to inquire whether America was first discovered by a wandering vessel of that celebrated Phoenician fleet, which, according to Herodotus, circumnavigated Africa, or by that Carthaginian expedition which, Pliny the naturalist informs us, discovered the Canary Islands, or whether it was settled by a temporary colony from Tyre, as hinted by Aristotle and Seneca. I shall neither inquire whether it was first discovered by the Chinese, as Vossius with great shrewdness advances, nor by the Norwegians in 1002 under Byron, nor by Behem the German navigator, as Mr. Otto has endeavored to prove to the savants of the learned city of Philadelphia. Nor shall I investigate the more modern claims of the Welsh, founded on the voyage of Prince Madoc in the 11th century, who, having never returned, it has since been wisely concluded that he must have gone to America, and that for a plain reason if he did not go there, where else could he have gone? A question which most Socratically shuts out all further dispute. Laying aside, therefore, all the conjectures above mentioned, with a multitude of others equally satisfactory, I shall take for granted the vulgar opinion that America was discovered on the 12th of October, 1492, by Christopher Colon, a Genoese who has been clumsily nicknamed Columbus, but for what reason I cannot discern. Of the voyages and adventures of this Colon I shall say nothing, seeing that they are already sufficiently known. Nor shall I undertake to prove that this country should have been called Colonia, after his name, that being notoriously self-evident. Having thus happily got my readers on this side of the Atlantic, I picture them to myself, all impatience to enter upon the enjoyment of the land of promise, and in full expectation that I will immediately deliver it into their possession. But if I do, may I ever forfeit the reputation of a regular-bred historian. No, no, most curious and thrice-learned readers, for thrice learned ye are if ye have read all that has gone before, and 9 times learned shall ye be if ye read that which comes after. We have yet a world of work before us. Think you the first discoverers of this fair quarter of the globe had nothing to do but go on shore and find a country ready laid out and cultivated like a garden, wherein they might revel at their ease? No such thing. They had forests to cut down, underwood to grub up, marshes to drain, and savages to exterminate. In like manner, I have sundry doubts to clear away, questions to resolve, and paradoxes to explain before I permit you to range at random. But these difficulties once overcome, we shall be enabled to jog on right merrily through the rest of our history. Thus my work shall, in a manner, echo the nature of the subject, in the same manner as the sound of poetry has been found by certain shrewd critics to echo the sense, this being an improvement in history which I claim the merit of having invented. Chapter 4. The next inquiry at which we arrive in the regular course of our history is to ascertain, if possible, how this country was originally peopled, a point fruitful of incredible embarrassments. For unless we prove that the aborigines did absolutely come from somewhere, it will be immediately asserted in this age of skepticism that they did not come at all, and if they did not come at all, then was this country never populated. A conclusion perfectly agreeable to the rules of logic, but wholly irreconcilable to every feeling of humanity, inasmuch as it must syllogistically prove fatal to the innumerable aborigines of this populous region. To avert so dire a sophism, and to rescue from logical annihilation so many millions of fellow creatures, how many wings of geese have been plundered, what oceans of ink have been benevolently drained, and how many capacious heads of learned historians have been addled and forever confounded, I pause with reverential awe when I contemplate the ponderous tomes in different languages, with which they have endeavored to solve this question, so important to the happiness of society, but so involved in clouds of impenetrable obscurity. Historian after historian has engaged in the endless circle of hypothetical argument, and, after leading us a weary chase through octavos, quartos, and folios, has led us out at the end of his work just as wise as we were at the beginning. It was doubtless some philosophical wild-goose chase of the kind that made the old poet Macrobius rail in such a passion at curiosity, which he anathematizes most heartily as an irksome, agonizing care, a superstitious industry about unprofitable things, an itching humor to see what is not to be seen, and to be doing what signifies nothing when it is done. But to proceed. Of the claims of the children of Noah to the original population of this country I shall say nothing, as they have already been touched upon in my last chapter. The claimants next in celebrity are the descendants of Abraham. Thus Cristobal Colon, vulgarly called Columbus, when he first discovered the gold mines of Hispaniola, immediately concluded, with a shrewdness that would have done honor to a philosopher, that he had found the ancient Ophir, from whence Solomon procured the gold for embellishing the temple at Jerusalem. Nay, Colon even imagined that he saw the remains of furnaces of veritable Hebraic construction, employed in refining the precious ore. So golden a conjecture, tinctured with such fascinating extravagance, was too tempting not to be immediately snapped at by the gudgeons of learning, and accordingly there were diverse profound writers ready to swear to its correctness, and to bring in their usual load of authorities and wise surmises, wherewithal to prop it up. Vedablus and Robert Stevens declared nothing could be more clear. Arius Montanus, without the least hesitation, asserts that Mexico was the true Ophir, and the Jews the early settlers of the country. While Passivin, Buchan, and several other sagacious writers lug in a supposed prophecy of the fourth book of Esdras, which being inserted in the mighty hypothesis like the keystone of an arch, gives it, in their opinion, perpetual durability. Scarce, however, have they completed their goodly superstructure when in trudges a phalanx of opposite authors with Hans de Laet, the great Dutchman, at their head, and at one blow tumbles the whole fabric about their ears. Hans, in fact, contradicts outright all the Israelitish claims to the first settlement of this country, attributing all those equivocal symptoms and traces of Christianity and Judaism, which have been said to be found in diverse provinces of the New World, to the devil, who has always affected to counterfeit the worship of the true deity. A remark, says the knowing old Padre d'Acosta, made by all good authors who have spoken of the religion of nations newly discovered, and founded, besides, on the authority of the fathers of the Church. Some writers again, among whom it is with much regret I am compelled to mention Lopez de Gamara and Juan de Luri, insinuate that the Canaanites, being driven from the land of promise by the Jews, were seized with such a panic that they fled without looking behind them, until stopping to take breath, they found themselves safe in America. As they brought neither their national language, manners, nor features with them, it is supposed they left them behind in the hurry of their flight. I cannot give my faith to this opinion. I pass over the supposition of the learned Grotius, who being both an ambassador and a Dutchman to boot, is entitled to great respect, that North America was peopled by a strolling company of Norwegians, and that Peru was founded by a colony from China, Manco or Mungo Capac, the first Incas, being himself a Chinese. Nor shall I more than barely mention that Father Kircher ascribes the settlement of America to the Egyptians, Budbeck to the Scandinavians, Charon to the Gauls, Geoffridas Petri to a skating party from Friesland, Mylius to the Celti, Marinocus the Sicilian to the Romans, LeConte to the Phoenicians, Postal to the Moors, Martin d'Angleria to the Abyssinians, together with the sage surmise of de Laet, that England, Ireland, and the Orcades may contend for that honor. Nor will I bestow any more attention or credit to the idea that America is the fairy region of Zipangri, described by that dreaming traveler Marco Polo the Venetian, or that it comprises the visionary island of Atlantis, described by Plato. Neither will I stop to investigate the heathenish assertion of Paracelsus, that each hemisphere of the globe was originally furnished with an Adam and Eve, or the more flattering opinion of Dr. Romaine, supported by many nameless authorities, that Adam was of the Indian race, or the startling conjecture of Buffon, Helvetius, and Darwin, so highly honorable to mankind, that the whole human species is accidentally descended from a remarkable family of monkeys. This last conjecture, I must own, came upon me very suddenly and very ungraciously. I have often beheld the clown in a pantomime, while gazing in stupid wonder at the extravagant gambols of a harlequin, all at once electrified by a sudden stroke of the wooden sword across his shoulders. Little did I think at such times that it would ever fall to my lot to be treated with equal discourtesy, and that while I was quietly beholding these grave philosophers emulating the eccentric transformations of the hero of pantomime, they would on a sudden turn upon me and my readers, and with one hypocritical flourish metamorphose us into beasts. I determined from that moment not to burn my fingers with any more of their theories, but content myself with detailing the different methods by which they transported the descendants of these ancient and respectable monkeys to this great field of theoretical warfare. This was done either by migrations by land or transmigrations by water. Thus Padre Joseph d'Acosta enumerates 3 passages by land, first by the north of Europe, secondly by the north of Asia, and, thirdly, by regions southward of the Straits of Magellan. The learned Grotius marches his Norwegians by a pleasant route across frozen rivers and arms of the sea, through Iceland, Greenland, Estotaland, and Narenberga, and various writers, among whom are Angleria, De Horn, and Buffon, anxious for the accommodation of these travelers, have fastened the 2 continents together by a strong chain of deductions, by which means they could pass over dryshod. But should even this fail, Pinkerton, that industrious old gentleman who compiles books and manufactures geographies, has constructed a natural bridge of ice, from continent to continent, at the distance of 4 or 5 miles from Bering Straits, for which he is entitled to the grateful thanks of all the wandering aborigines who ever did or ever will pass over it. It is an evil much to be lamented that none of the worthy writers above quoted could ever commence his work without immediately declaring hostilities against every writer who had treated of the same subject. In this particular authors may be compared to a certain sagacious bird, which, in building its nest, is sure to pull to pieces the nests of all the birds in its neighborhood. This unhappy propensity tends grievously to impede the progress of sound knowledge. Theories are at best but brittle productions, and when once committed to the stream, they should take care that, like the notable pots which were fellow voyagers, they do not crack each other. My chief surprise is, that among the many writers I have noticed, no one has attempted to prove that this country was peopled from the moon, or that the first inhabitants floated hither on islands of ice, as white bears cruise about the northern oceans, or that they were conveyed hither by balloons, as modern aeronauts pass from Dover to Calais, or by witchcraft, as Simon Magus posted among the stars, or after the manner of the renowned Scythian Abaris, who, like the New England witches on full-blooded broomsticks, made most unheard of journeys on the back of a golden arrow, given him by the Hyperborean Apollo. But there is still one mode left by which this country could have been peopled, which I have reserved for the last, because I consider it worth all the rest. It is by accident. Speaking of the islands of Solomon, New Guinea, and New Holland, the profound Father Charlevoix observes, "In fine, all these countries are peopled, and it is possible some have been so by accident. Now, if it could have happened in that manner, why might it not have been at the same time, and by the same means with the other parts of the globe?" This ingenious mode of deducing certain conclusions from possible premises is an improvement in syllogistic skill, and proves the good Father superior even to Archimedes, for he can turn the world without anything to rest his lever upon. It is only surpassed by the dexterity with which the sturdy old Jesuit in another place cuts the Gordian knot. "Nothing," says he, "is more easy. The inhabitants of both hemispheres are certainly the descendants of the same Father. The common Father of mankind received an express order from heaven to people the world, and accordingly it has been peopled. To bring this about it was necessary to overcome all difficulties in the way, and they have also been overcome. Pious logician, how does he put all the herd of laborious theorists to the blush? By explaining in 5 words what it has cost them volumes to prove they knew nothing about. From all the authorities here quoted, and a variety of others which I have consulted, but which are omitted through fear of fatiguing the unlearned reader, I can only draw the following conclusions, which luckily, however, are sufficient for my purpose. First, that this part of the world has actually been peopled, QED, to support which we have living proofs in the numerous tribes of Indians that inhabit it. Secondly, that it has been peopled in 500 different ways, as proved by a cloud of authors, who, from the positiveness of their assertions, seem to have been eyewitnesses to the fact. Thirdly, that the people of this country had a variety of fathers, which, as it may not be thought much to their credit by the common run of readers, the less we say on the subject the better. The question, therefore, I trust, is forever at rest. Chapter 5. The writer of a history may, in some respects, be likened unto an adventurous knight, who having undertaken a perilous enterprise by way of establishing his fame, feels bound, in honor and chivalry, to turn back for no difficulty nor hardship, and never to shrink or quail whatever enemy he may encounter. Under this impression, I resolutely draw my pen, and fall to with might and main at those doughty questions and subtle paradoxes which, like fiery dragons and bloody giants, beset the entrance to my history, and would fain repulse me from the very threshold. And at this moment a gigantic question has started up, which I must needs take by the beard and utterly subdue before I can advance another step in my historic undertaking. But I trust this will be the last adversary I shall have to contend with, and that in the next book I shall be enabled to conduct my readers in triumph into the body of my work. The question which has thus suddenly arisen is, what right had the first discoverers of America to land and take possession of a country without first gaining the consent of its inhabitants, or yielding them an adequate compensation for their territory? A question which has withstood many fierce assaults, and has given much distress of mind to multitudes of kind-hearted folk. And, indeed, until it be totally vanquished, and put to rest, the worthy people of America can by no means enjoy the soil they inhabit with clear right and title, and quiet, unsullied conscience. The first source of right by which property is acquired in a country is discovery. For as all mankind have an equal right to anything which has never before been appropriated, so any nation that discovers an uninhabited country, and takes possession thereof, is considered as enjoying full property, and absolute, unquestionable empire therein. This proposition being admitted, it follows clearly that the Europeans who first visited America were the real discoverers of the same, nothing being necessary to the establishment of this fact but simply to prove that it was totally uninhabited by man. This would at first appear to be a point of some difficulty, for it is well known that this quarter of the world abounded with certain animals that walked erect on 2 feet, had something of the human countenance, uttered certain unintelligible sounds very much like language, in short, had a marvelous resemblance to human beings. But the zealous and enlightened fathers who accompanied the discoverers, for the purpose of promoting the kingdom of heaven by establishing fat monasteries and bishoprics on earth, soon cleared up this point, greatly to the satisfaction of His Holiness the Pope and of all Christian voyagers and discoverers. They plainly proved, and as there were no Indian writers arose on the other side, the fact was considered as fully admitted and established, that the 2-legged race of animals before mentioned were mere cannibals, detestable monsters, and many of them giants, which last description of vagrants have, since the time of Gog, Magog, and Goliath, been considered as outlaws and have received no quarter in either history, chivalry, or song. Indeed, even the philosophic Bacon declared the Americans to be people prescribed by the laws of nature, inasmuch as they had a barbarous custom of sacrificing men, and feeding upon man's flesh. Nor are these all the proofs of their utter barbarism. Among many other writers of discernment, Ola tells us, their imbecility is so visible that one can hardly form an idea of them different from what one has of the brutes. Nothing disturbs the tranquility of their souls, equally insensible to disasters and to prosperity. Though half naked, they are as contented as a monarch in his most splendid array. Fear makes no impression on them, and respect as little. All this is furthermore supported by the authority of M. Boggier. It is not easy, says he, to describe the degree of their indifference for wealth and all its advantages. One does not well know what motives to propose to them when one would persuade them to any service. It is vain to offer them money. They answer they are not hungry, and vain gas confirms the whole, assuring us that ambition they have none, and are more desirous of being thought strong than valiant. The objects of ambition with us, honor, fame, reputation, riches, posts, and distinctions, are unknown among them, so that this powerful spring of action, the cause of so much seeming good and real evil in the world, has no power over them. In a word, these unhappy mortals may be compared to children, in whom the development of reason is not completed. Now all these peculiarities, although in the unenlightened states of Greece they would have entitled their possessors to immortal honor, as having reduced to practice those rigid and abstemious maxims, the mere talking about which acquired certain old Greeks the reputation of sages and philosophers. Yet were they clearly proved in the present instance to betoken a most abject and brutified nature, totally beneath the human character. But the benevolent fathers, who had undertaken to turn these unhappy savages into dumb beasts by dint of argument, advanced still stronger proofs. For as certain divines of the 16th century, and among the rest Lullas, affirm, the Americans go naked and have no beards. They have nothing, says Lullas, of the reasonable animal except the mask. And even that mask was allowed to avail them but little, for it was soon found that they were of a hideous copper complexion, and being of a copper complexion, it was all the same as if they were Negroes, and Negroes are black, and black, said the pious fathers, devoutly crossing themselves, is the color of the devil. Therefore, so far from being able to own property, they had no right even to personal freedom, for liberty is too radiant a deity to inhabit such gloomy temples. All which circumstances plainly convinced the righteous followers of Cortés and Pizarro that these miscreants had no title to the soil that they infested, that they were a perverse, illiterate, dumb, beardless, black-seed, mere wild beasts of the forests and, like them, should either be subdued or exterminated. From the foregoing arguments, therefore, and a variety of others equally conclusive, which I forbear to enumerate, it is clearly evident that this fair quarter of the globe, when first visited by Europeans, was a howling wilderness, inhabited by nothing but wild beasts, and that the transatlantic visitors acquired an incontrovertible property therein, by the right of discovery. This right being fully established, we now come to the next, which is the right acquired by cultivation. The cultivation of the soil, we are told, is an obligation imposed by nature on mankind. The whole world is appointed for the nourishment of its inhabitants, but it would be incapable of doing it, was it uncultivated. Every nation is then obliged by the law of nature to cultivate the ground that has fallen to its share. Those people, like the ancient Germans and modern Tartars, who, having fertile countries, disdain to cultivate the earth and choose to live by rapine, are wanting to themselves, and deserve to be exterminated as savage and pernicious beasts. Now it is notorious that the savages knew nothing of agriculture when first discovered by the Europeans, but lived a most vagabond, disorderly, unrighteous life, rambling from place to place, and prodigally rioting upon the spontaneous luxuries of nature, without tasking her generosity to yield them anything more. Whereas it has been most unquestionably shown that heaven intended the earth should be plowed, and sown, and manured, and laid out into cities and towns and farms and country, seats and pleasure grounds and public gardens, all which the Indians knew nothing about. Therefore they did not improve the talents Providence had bestowed on them. Therefore they were careless stewards. Therefore they had no right to the soil. Therefore they deserved to be exterminated. It is true the savages might plead that they drew all the benefits from the land which their simple wants required. They found plenty of game to hunt, which, together with the roots and uncultivated fruits of the earth, furnished a sufficient variety for their frugal repasts, and that as heaven merely designed the earth to form the abode and satisfy the wants of man, so long as those purposes were answered the will of heaven was accomplished. But this only proves how undeserving they were of the blessings around them. They were so much the more savages for not having more wants. For knowledge is in some degree an increase of desires, and it is this superiority both in the number and magnitude of his desires that distinguishes the man from the beast. Therefore the Indians, in not having more wants, were very unreasonable animals, and it was but just that they should make way for the Europeans, who had 1,000 wants to their one, and, therefore, would turn the earth to more account, and by cultivating it more truly fulfill the will of heaven. Besides, Grotius and Lauterbach and Puffendorf and Titius and many wise men beside, who have considered the matter properly, have determined that the property of a country cannot be acquired by hunting, cutting wood, or drawing water in it. Nothing but precise demarcation of limits, and the intention of cultivation, can establish the possession. Now as the savages, probably from never having read the authors above quoted, had never complied with any of these necessary forms, it plainly follows that they had no right to the soil, but that it was completely at the disposal of the first comers, who had more knowledge, more wants, and more elegant, that is to say artificial, desires than themselves. In entering upon a newly discovered, uncultivated country, therefore, the newcomers were but taking possession of what, according to the aforesaid doctrine, was their own property. Therefore, in opposing them, the savages were invading their just rights, infringing the immutable laws of nature, and counteracting the will of heaven. Therefore, they were guilty of impiety, burglary, and trespass on the case. Therefore, they were hardened offenders against God and man. Therefore, they ought to be exterminated. But a more irresistible right than either that I have mentioned, and one which will be the most readily admitted by my reader, provided he be blessed with bowels of charity and philanthropy, is the right acquired by civilization. All the world knows the lamentable state in which these poor savages were found. Not only deficient in the comforts of life, but, what is still worse, most piteously and unfortunately blind to the miseries of their situation. But no sooner did the benevolent inhabitants of Europe behold their sad condition than they immediately went to work to ameliorate and improve it. They introduced among them rum, gin, brandy, and the other comforts of life, and it is astonishing to read how soon the poor savages learned to estimate those blessings. They likewise made known to them 1,000 remedies, by which the most inveterate diseases are alleviated and healed, and that they might comprehend the benefits and enjoy the comforts of these medicines, they previously introduced among them the diseases which they were calculated to cure. By these and a variety of other methods was the condition of these poor savages wonderfully improved. They acquired 1,000 wants of which they had before been ignorant, and as he has most sources of happiness who has most wants to be gratified, they were doubtlessly rendered a much happier race of beings. But the most important branch of civilization, and which has most strenuously been extolled by the zealous and pious fathers of the Roman Church, is the introduction of the Christian faith. It was truly a sight that might well inspire horror, to behold these savages tumbling among the dark mountains of paganism, and guilty of the most horrible ignorance of religion. It is true, they neither stole nor defrauded. They were sober, frugal, continent, and faithful to their word. But though they acted right habitually, it was all in vain, unless they acted so from precept. The newcomers, therefore, used every method to induce them to embrace and practice the true religion, except, indeed, that of setting them the example. But notwithstanding all these complicated labors for their good, such was the unparalleled obstinacy of these stubborn wretches, that they ungratefully refused to acknowledge the strangers as their benefactors, and persisted in disbelieving the doctrines they endeavored to inculcate, most insolently alleging that, from their conduct, the advocates of Christianity did not seem to believe in it themselves. Was not this too much for human patience? Would not one suppose that the benign visitants from Europe, provoked at their incredulity and discouraged by their stiff-necked obstinacy, would forever have abandoned their shores, and consigned them to their original ignorance and misery? But no. So zealous were they to effect the temporal comfort and eternal salvation of these pagan infidels that they even proceeded from the milder means of persuasion to the more painful and troublesome one of persecution, let loose among them whole troops of fiery monks and furious bloodhounds, purified them by fire and sword, by stake and faggot, in consequence of which indefatigable measures the cause of Christian love and charity was so rapidly advanced that in a few years not 1/5 of the number of unbelievers existed in South America that were found there at the time of its discovery. What stronger right need the European settlers advance to the country than this? Have not whole nations of uninformed savages been made acquainted with 1,000 imperious wants and indispensable comforts of which they were before wholly ignorant? Have they not been literally hunted and smoked out of the dens and lurking places of ignorance and infidelity, and absolutely scourged into the right path? Have not the temporal things, the vain baubles and filthy lucre of this world, which were too apt to engage their worldly and selfish thoughts, been benevolently taken from them, and have they not, instead thereof, been taught to set their affections on things above? And finally, to use the words of a reverend Spanish father, in a letter to his superior in Spain, can anyone have the presumption to say that these savage pagans have yielded anything more than an inconsiderable recompense to their benefactors, in surrendering to them a little pitiful tract of this dirty sublunary planet, in exchange for a glorious inheritance in the kingdom of heaven? Here, then, are 3 complete and undeniable sources of right established, any one of which was more than ample to establish a property in the newly discovered regions of America. Now, so it has happened in certain parts of this delightful quarter of the globe that the right of discovery has been so strenuously asserted, the influence of cultivation so industriously extended, and the progress of salvation and civilization so zealously persecuted, that, what with their attendant wars, persecutions, oppressions, diseases, and other partial evils that often hang on the skirts of great benefits, the savage aborigines have, somehow or other, been utterly annihilated, and this, all at once, brings me to a 4th right, which is worth all the others put together. For the original claimants to the soil being all dead and buried, and no one remaining to inherit or dispute the soil, the Spaniards, as the next immediate occupants, entered upon the possession as clearly as the hangman succeeds to the clothes of the malefactor, and as they have Blackstone and all the learned expounders of the law on their side, they may set all actions of ejectment at defiance, and this last right may be entitled the right by extermination, or in other words, the right by gunpowder. But lest any scruples of conscience should remain on this head, and to settle the question of right forever, His Holiness Pope Alexander VI issued a mighty bull, by which he generously granted the newly discovered quarter of the globe to the Spaniards and Portuguese, who, thus having law and gospel on their side, and being inflamed with great spiritual zeal, showed the pagan savages neither favor nor affection, but persecuted the work of discovery, colonization, civilization, and extermination with 10 times more fury than ever. Thus were the European worthies who first discovered America clearly entitled to the soil, and not only entitled to the soil, but likewise to the eternal thanks of these infidel savages, for having come so far, endured so many perils by sea and land, and taken such unwearied pains, for no other purpose but to improve their forlorn, uncivilized, and heathenish condition, for having made them acquainted with the comforts of life, for having introduced among them the light of religion, and, finally, for having hurried them out of the world to enjoy its reward. But as argument is never so well understood by us selfish mortals as when it comes home to ourselves, and as I am particularly anxious that this question should be put to rest forever, I will suppose a parallel case, by way of arousing the candid attention of my readers. Let us suppose, then, that the inhabitants of the moon, by astonishing advancement in science, and by profound insight into that ineffable lunar philosophy, the mere flickerings of which have of late years dazzled the feebled optics, and addled the shallow brains of the good people of our globe, let us suppose, I say, that the inhabitants of the moon, by these means, had arrived at such a command of their energies, such an enviable state of perfectibility, as to control the elements and navigate the boundless regions of space. Let us suppose a roving crew of these soaring philosophers, in the course of an aerial voyage of discovery among the stars, should chance to alight upon this outlandish planet. And here I beg my readers will not have the uncharitableness to smile, as is too frequently the fault of volatile readers, when perusing the grave speculations of philosophers. I am far from indulging in any sportive vein at present, nor is the supposition I have been making so wild as many may deem it. It has long been a very serious and anxious question with me, and many a time and oft, in the course of my overwhelming cares and contrivances for the welfare and protection of this my native planet, have I lain awake whole nights debating in my mind whether it were most probable we should first discover and civilize the moon, or the moon discover and civilize our globe. Neither would the prodigy of sailing in the air or cruising among the stars be a whit more astonishing and incomprehensible to us than was the European mystery of navigating floating castles through the world of waters to the simple savages. We have already discovered the art of coasting along the aerial shores of our planet by means of balloons, as the savages had of venturing along their seacoasts in canoes, and the disparity between the former and the aerial vehicles of the philosophers from the moon might not be greater than that between the bark canoes of the savages and the mighty ships of their discoverers. I might here pursue an endless chain of similar speculations, but as they would be unimportant to my subject, I abandon them to my reader, particularly if he be a philosopher, as matters well worthy of his attentive consideration. To return, then, to my supposition, let us suppose that the aerial visitants I have mentioned possessed of vastly superior knowledge to ourselves, that is to say, possessed of superior knowledge in the art of extermination, riding on hippogriffs, defended with impenetrable armor, armed with concentrated sunbeams, and provided with vast engines to hurl enormous moonstones. In short, let us suppose them, if our vanity will permit the supposition, as superior to us in knowledge, and consequently in power, as the Europeans were to the Indians when they first discovered them. All this is very possible. It is only our self-sufficiency that makes us think otherwise. And I warrant the poor savages, before they had any knowledge of the white men, armed in all the terrors of glittering steel and tremendous gunpowder, were as perfectly convinced that they themselves were the wisest, the most virtuous, powerful, and perfect of created beings, as are at this present moment the lordly inhabitants of Old England, the volatile populace of France, or even the self-satisfied citizens of this most enlightened republic. Let us suppose, moreover, that the aerial voyagers, finding this planet to be nothing but a howling wilderness, inhabited by us poor savages and wild beasts, shall take formal possession of it, in the name of his most gracious and philosophic excellency, the man in the moon. Finding, however, that their numbers are incompetent to hold it in complete subjection, on account of the ferocious barbarity of its inhabitants, they shall take our worthy president, the King of England, the Emperor of Haiti, the mighty Bonaparte, and the great King of Bantam, and, returning to their native planet, shall carry them to court, as were the Indian chiefs led about as spectacles in the courts of Europe. Then, making such obeisance as the etiquette of the court requires, they shall address the puissant man in the moon in, as near as I can conjecture, the following terms. Most serene and mighty potentate, whose dominions extend as far as I can reach, who rideth on the great bear, useth the sun as a looking-glass, and maintaineth unrivaled control over tides, madmen, and sea-crabs. We, thy liege subjects, have just returned from a voyage of discovery, in the course of which we have landed and taken possession of that obscure little dirty planet, which thou beholdest rolling at a distance. The 5 uncouth monsters which we have brought into this august present were once very important chiefs among their fellow savages, who are a race of beings totally destitute of the common attributes of humanity, and differing in everything from the inhabitants of the moon, inasmuch as they carry their heads upon their shoulders, instead of under their arms, have 2 eyes instead of 1, are utterly destitute of tails, and of a variety of unseemly complexions, particularly of horrible whiteness, instead of pea-green. We have moreover found these miserable savages sunk into a state of the utmost ignorance and depravity, every man shamelessly living with his own wife, and rearing his own children, instead of indulging in that community of wives enjoined by the law of nature, as expounded by the philosophers of the moon. In a word, they have scarcely a gleam of true philosophy among them, but are, in fact, utter heretics, ignoramuses, and barbarians. Taking compassion, therefore, on the sad condition of these sublunary wretches, we have endeavored, while we remained on their planet, to introduce among them the light of reason and the comforts of the moon. We have treated them to mouthfuls of moonshine and draughts of nitrous oxide, which they swallowed with incredible voracity, particularly the females, and we have likewise endeavored to instill into them the precepts of lunar philosophy. We have insisted upon their renouncing the contemptible shackles of religion and common sense, and adoring the profound, omnipotent, and all-perfect energy, and the ecstatic, immutable, immovable perfection. But such was the unparalleled obstinacy of these wretched savages that they persisted in cleaving to their wives, and adhering to their religion, and absolutely set at naught the sublime doctrines of the moon. Nay, among other abominable heresies, they even went so far as blasphemously to declare that this ineffable planet was made of nothing more nor less than green cheese. At these words, the great man in the moon, being a very profound philosopher, shall fall into a terrible passion, and possessing equal authority over things that do not belong to him, as did whilome his holiness the Pope, shall forthwith issue a formidable bull, specifying that whereas a certain crew of lunatics have lately discovered and taken possession of a newly discovered planet called the Earth, and that whereas it is inhabited by none but a race of 2-legged animals that carry their heads on their shoulders instead of under their arms, cannot talk the lunatic language, have 2 eyes instead of 1, are destitute of tails and of a horrible whiteness instead of pea-green, therefore, and for a variety of other excellent reasons, they are considered incapable of possessing any property in the planet they infest, and the right and title to it are confirmed to its original discoverers. And, furthermore, the colonists who are now about to depart to the aforesaid planet are authorized and commanded to use every means to convert these infidel savages from the darkness of Christianity, and make them thorough and absolute lunatics. In consequence of this benevolent bull, our philosophic benefactors go to work with hearty zeal. They seize upon our fertile territories, scourge us from our rightful possessions, relieve us from our wives, and when we are unreasonable enough to complain, they will turn upon us and say, "Miserable barbarians, ungrateful wretches, have we not come thousands of miles to improve your worthless planet? Have we not fed you with moonshine? Have we not intoxicated you with nitrous oxide? Does not our moon give you light every night? And have you the baseness to murmur, when we claim a pitiful return for all these benefits?" But finding that we not only persist in absolute contempt of their reasoning and disbelief in their philosophy, but even go so far as daringly to defend our property, their patience shall be exhausted, and they shall resort to their superior powers of argument, hunt us with hippogriffs, transfix us with concentrated sunbeams, demolish our cities with moonstones, until having by main force converted us to the true faith, they shall graciously permit us to exist in the torrid deserts of Arabia, or the frozen regions of Lapland, there to enjoy the blessings of civilization and the charms of lunar philosophy, in much the same manner as the reformed and enlightened savages of this country are kindly suffered to inhabit the inhospitable forests of the north or the impenetrable wilderness of South America. Thus, I hope, I have clearly proved, and strikingly illustrated, the right of the early colonists to the possession of this country. And thus is this gigantic question completely vanquished. So having manfully surmounted all obstacles, and subdued all opposition, what remains but that I should forthwith conduct my readers into the city which we have been so long in a manner besieging. But hold, before I proceed another step I must pause to take breath, and recover from the excessive fatigue I have undergone, in preparing to begin this most accurate of histories. And in this I do but imitate the example of a renowned Dutch tumbler of antiquity, who took a start of 3 miles for the purpose of jumping over a hill, but having run himself out of breath by the time he reached the foot, sat himself quietly down for a few moments to blow, and then walked over it at his leisure. Book 2. Treating of the First Settlement of the Province of New Netherlands. Chapter 1. My great-grandfather by the mother's side, Hermanus van Clatterkop, when employed to build the large stone church at Rotterdam, which stands about 300 yards to your left after you turn off from the Boomkees, and which is so conveniently constructed that all the zealous Christians of Rotterdam prefer sleeping through a sermon there to any other church in the city. My great-grandfather, I say, when employed to build that famous church, did in the first place send to Delft for a box of long pipes. Then having purchased a new spitting box and 100 weight of the best Virginia, he sat himself down, and did nothing for the space of 3 months but smoke most laboriously. Then did he spend full 3 months more in trudging on foot and voyaging in the trekschuit from Rotterdam to Amsterdam to Delft to Haarlem to Leiden to The Hague, knocking his head and breaking his pipe against every church in his road. Then did he advance gradually nearer and nearer to Rotterdam, until he came in full sight of the identical spot whereon the church was to be built. Then did he spend 3 months longer in walking round it and round it, contemplating it first from one point of view and then from another. Now he would be paddled by it on the canal, now would he peep at it through a telescope from the other side of the Meuse, and now would he take a bird's-eye glance at it, from the top of one of those gigantic windmills which protect the gates of the city. The good folks of the place were on the tiptoe of expectation and impatience. Notwithstanding all the turmoil of my great-grandfather, not a symptom of the church was yet to be seen. They even began to fear it would never be brought into the world, but that its great projector would lie down and die in labor of the mighty plan he had conceived. At length, having occupied 12 good months in puffing and paddling and talking and walking, having traveled over all Holland and even taken a peep into France and Germany, having smoked 599 pipes and 300 weight of the best Virginia tobacco, my great-grandfather gathered together all that knowing and industrious class of citizens who prefer attending to anybody's business sooner than their own, and having pulled off his coat and 5 pair of breeches, he advanced sturdily up, and laid the cornerstone of the church, in the presence of the whole multitude, just at the commencement of the 13th month. In a similar manner, and with the example of my worthy ancestor full before my eyes, have I proceeded in writing this most authentic history. The honest Rotterdammers no doubt thought my great-grandfather was doing nothing at all to the purpose, while he was making such a world of prefatory bustle about the building of his church, and many of the ingenious inhabitants of this fair city will unquestionably suppose that all the preliminary chapters, with the discovery, population, and final settlement of America, were totally irrelevant and superfluous, and that the main business, the history of New York, is not a jot more advanced than. If I had never taken up my pen, never were wise people more mistaken in their conjectures. In consequence of going to work slowly and deliberately, the church came out of my grandfather's hands one of the most sumptuous, goodly, and glorious edifices in the known world, excepting that, like our magnificent Capitol at Washington, it was begun on so grand a scale that the good folk could not afford to finish more than the wing of it. So, likewise, I trust, if ever I am able to finish this work on the plan I have commenced, of which, in simple truth, I sometimes have my doubts, it will be found that I have pursued the latest rules of my art, as exemplified in the writings of all the great American historians, and wrought a very large history out of a small subject, which nowadays is considered one of the great triumphs of historic skill. To proceed, then, with the thread of my story. In the ever-memorable year of our Lord 1609, on a Saturday morning, the 25th day of March Old Style, did that worthy and irrecoverable discoverer, as he has justly been called, Master Henry Hudson, set sail from Holland in a stout vessel called the Half Moon, being employed by the Dutch East India Company to seek a northwest passage to China. Henry, or, as the Dutch historians call him, Hendrik Hudson, was a seafaring man of renown, who had learned to smoke tobacco under Sir Walter Raleigh, and is said to have been the first to introduce it into Holland, which gained him much popularity in that country, and caused him to find great favor in the eyes of their high mightinesses the Lord States General, and also of the Honorable West India Company. He was a short, square, brawny old gentleman, with a double chin, a mastiff mouth, and a broad copper nose, which was supposed in those days to have acquired its fiery hue from the constant neighborhood of his tobacco pipe. He wore a true Andrea Ferrara tucked in a leathern belt, and a Commodore's cocked hat on one side of his head. He was remarkable for always jerking up his breeches when he gave out his orders, and his voice sounded not unlike the brattling of a tin trumpet, owing to the number of hard northwesters which he had swallowed in the course of his seafaring. Such was Hendrik Hudson, of whom we have heard so much and know so little, and I have been thus particular in his description, for the benefit of modern painters and statuaries, that they may represent him as he was, and not, according to their common custom with modern heroes, make him look like a Caesar or Marcus Aurelius, or the Apollo of Belvedere. As chief mate and favorite companion, the Commodore chose Master Robert Juet, of Limehouse, in England. By some his name has been spelt Che-Wit, and ascribed to the circumstance of his having been the first man that ever chewed tobacco. But this I believe to be a mere flippancy, more especially as certain of his progeny are living at this day who write their names Juet. He was an old comrade and early schoolmate of the great Hudson, with whom he had often played truant and sailed chip boats in a neighboring pond, when they were little boys, from whence, it is said, the Commodore first derived his bias towards a seafaring life. Certain it is that the old people about Limehouse declared Robert Juet to be a unlucky urchin prone to mischief, that would one day or other come to the gallows. He grew up as boys of that kind often grow up, a rambling, heedless varlet, tossed about in all quarters of the world, meeting with more perils and wonders than did Sinbad the sailor, without growing a whit more wise, prudent, or ill-natured. Under every misfortune he comforted himself with a quid of tobacco, and the truly philosophic maxim that it will be all the same thing 100 years hence. He was skilled in the art of carving anchors and true lovers knot on the bulkheads and quarter railings, and was considered a great wit on board ship, in consequence of his playing pranks on everybody around, and now and then even making a wry face at old Hendrik when his back was turned. To this universal genius are we indebted for many particulars concerning this voyage, of which he wrote a history, at the request of the Commodore, who had an unconquerable aversion to writing himself, from having received so many floggings about it when at school. To supply the deficiencies of Master Juet's journal, which is written with true logbook brevity, I have availed myself of diverse family traditions, handed down from my great-great-grandfather, who accompanied the expedition in the capacity of cabin boy. From all that I can learn, few incidents worthy of remark happened in the voyage, and it mortifies me exceedingly that I have to admit so noted an expedition into my work without making any more of it. Suffice it to say, the voyage was prosperous and tranquil, the crew, being a patient people, much given to slumber and vacuity, and but little troubled with the disease of thinking, a malady of the mind, which is the sure breeder of discontent. Hudson had laid in abundance of gin and sauerkraut, and every man was allowed to sleep quietly at his post unless the wind blew. True it is, some slight dissatisfaction was shown on 2 or 3 occasions at certain unreasonable conduct of Commodore Hudson. Thus, for instance, he forbore to shorten sail when the wind was light and the weather serene, which was considered among the most experienced Dutch seamen as certain weather breeders or prognostics, that the weather would change for the worse. He acted, moreover, in direct contradiction to that ancient and sage rule of the Dutch navigators, who always took in sail at night, put the helm a port and turned in, by which precaution they had a good night's rest, were sure of knowing where they were the next morning, and stood but little chance of running down a continent in the dark. He likewise prohibited the seamen from wearing more than 5 jackets and 6 pair of breeches, under pretence of rendering them more alert, and no man was permitted to go aloft and hand in sails with a pipe in his mouth, as is the invariable Dutch custom at the present day. All these grievances, though they might ruffle for a moment the constitutional tranquility of the honest Dutch tars, made but transient impression. They ate hugely, drank profusely, and slept immeasurably. And being under the especial guidance of Providence, the ship was safely conducted to the coast of America, where, after sundry unimportant touchings and standings off and on, she at length, on the 4th day of September, entered that majestic bay which at this day expands its ample bosom before the city of New York, and which had never before been visited by any European. It has been traditionary in our family that when the great navigator was first blessed with a view of this enchanting island, he was observed, for the first and only time in his life, to exhibit strong symptoms of astonishment and admiration. He is said to have turned to Master Juet, and uttered these remarkable words, while he pointed towards this paradise of the New World, "See, there!" And thereupon, as was always his way when he was uncommonly pleased, he did puff out such clouds of dense tobacco smoke that in 1 minute the vessel was out of sight of land, and Master Juet was fain to wait until the winds dispersed this impenetrable fog. It was indeed, as my great-grandfather used to say, though in truth I never heard him, for he died, as might be expected, before I was born. It was indeed a spot on which the eye might have reveled forever, in ever new and never-ending beauties. The island of Mannahatta spread wide before them, like some sweet vision of fancy, or some fair creation of industrious magic. Its hills of smiling green swelled gently one above another, crowned with lofty trees of luxuriant growth, some pointing their tapering foliage towards the clouds which were gloriously transparent, and others loaded with a verdant burden of clambering vines, bowing their branches to the earth that was covered with flowers. On the gentle declivities of the hills were scattered in gay profusion the dogwood, the sumac, and the wild briar, whose scarlet berries and white blossoms glowed brightly among the deep green of the surrounding foliage. And here and there a curling column of smoke rising from the little glens that opened along the shore seemed to promise the weary voyagers a welcome at the hands of their fellow creatures. As they stood gazing with entranced attention on the scene before them, a red man, crowned with feathers, issued from one of these glens, and after contemplating in silent wonder the gallant ship, as she sat like a stately swan swimming on a silver lake, sounded the war-whoop, and bounded into the woods like a wild deer, to the utter astonishment of the phlegmatic Dutchmen, who had never heard such a noise or witnessed such a caper in their whole lives. Of the transactions of our adventurers with the savages, and how the latter smoked copper pipes and ate dried currants, how they brought great store of tobacco and oysters, how they shot one of the ship's crew, and how he was buried, I shall say nothing, being that I consider them unimportant to my history. After tarrying a few days in the bay, in order to refresh themselves after their seafaring, our voyagers weighed anchor, to explore a mighty river which emptied into the bay. This river, it is said, was known among the savages by the name of the Shaitmuck, though we are assured in an excellent little history published in 1674, by John Jocelyn, Gent, that it was called the Mohegan, and Master Richard Bloom, who wrote some time afterwards, asserts the same, so that I very much incline in favor of the opinion of these two honest gentlemen. Be this as it may, up this river did the adventurous Hendrik proceed, little doubting but it would turn to be the much-looked-for passage to China. The journal goes on to make mention of divers interviews between the crew and the natives in the voyage up the river, but as they would be impertinent to my history, I shall pass over them in silence, except the following dry joke, played off by the old Commodore and his schoolfellow Robert Juet, which does such vast credit to their experimental philosophy that I cannot refrain from inserting it. Our master and his mate determined to try some of the chief men of the Country, whether they had any treachery in them. So they took them down into the cabin, and gave them so much wine and aqua vitae that they were all merry, and one of them had his wife with him, which sate so modestly, as any of our Country women would do in a strange place. In the end, one of them was drunk, which had been aboard of our ship all the time that we had been there, and that was strange to them, for they could not tell how to take it. Having satisfied himself by this ingenious experiment that the natives were an honest, social race of jolly roisterers, who had no objection to a drinking bout, and were very merry in their cups, the old Commodore chuckled hugely to himself, and thrusting a double quid of tobacco in his cheek, directed Master Juet to have it carefully recorded, for the satisfaction of all the natural philosophers of the University of Leiden, which done, he proceeded on his voyage with great self-complacency. After sailing, however, above 100 miles up the river, he found the watery world around him began to grow more shallow and confined, the current more rapid and perfectly fresh. phenomena not uncommon in the ascent of rivers, but which puzzled the honest Dutchman prodigiously. A consultation was therefore called, and having deliberated full 6 hours, they were brought to a determination by the ships running aground, whereupon they unanimously concluded that there was but little chance of getting to China in this direction. A boat, however, was dispatched to explore higher up the river, which, on its return, confirmed the opinion. Upon this the ship was warped off and put about with great difficulty, being, like most of her sex, exceedingly hard to govern, and the adventurous Hudson, according to the account of my great-great-grandfather, returned down the river, with a prodigious flea in his ear, being satisfied that there was little likelihood of getting to China, unless, like the blind man, he returned from whence he set out and took a fresh start. He forthwith recrossed the sea to Holland, where he was received with great welcome by the Honorable East India Company, who were very much rejoiced to see him come back safe with their ship, and at a large and respectable meeting of the first merchants and burgomasters of Amsterdam, it was unanimously determined that, as a munificent reward for the eminent services he had performed, and the important discovery he had made, the great river Mohegan should be called after his name, and it continues to be called Hudson River unto this very day. Chapter 2. The delectable accounts given by the great Hudson and Master Jewett of the country they had discovered excited not a little talk and speculation among the good people of Holland. Letters patent were granted by government to an association of merchants, called the West India Company, for the exclusive trade on Hudson River, on which they erected a trading house called Fort Orania or Orange, from whence did spring the great city of Albany. But I forbear to dwell on the various commercial and colonizing enterprises which took place, among which was that of Mynheer Adrian Block, who discovered and gave a name to Block Island, since famous for its cheese, and shall barely confine myself to that which gave birth to this renowned city. It was some 3 or 4 years after the return of the immortal Hendrik that a crew of honest Low Dutch colonists set sail from the city of Amsterdam for the shores of America. It is an irreparable loss to history, and a great proof of the darkness of the age and the lamentable neglect of the noble art of bookmaking, since so industriously cultivated by knowing sea captains and learned supercargoes, that an expedition so interesting and important in its results should be passed over in utter silence. To my great-great-grandfather am I again indebted for the few facts I am enabled to give concerning it. He having once more embarked for this country, with a full determination, as he said, of ending his days here, and of begetting a race of Knickerbockers that should rise to be great men in the land. The ship in which these illustrious adventurers set sail was called the Goede Vrouw, or Good Woman, in compliment to the wife of the president of the West India Company, who was allowed by everybody, except her husband, to be a sweet-tempered lady, when not in liquor. It was in truth a most gallant vessel, of the most approved Dutch construction, and made by the ablest ship carpenters of Amsterdam, who, it is well known, always model their ships after the fair forms of their countrywomen. Accordingly, it had 100 feet in the beam, 100 feet in the keel, and 100 feet from the bottom of the sternpost to the taffrail. Like the beauteous model, who was declared to be the greatest belle in Amsterdam, it was full in the bows, with a pair of enormous catheads, a copper bottom, and withal a most prodigious poop. The architect, who was somewhat of a religious man, far from decorating the ship with pagan idols, such as Jupiter, Neptune, or Hercules, which heathenish abominations, I have no doubt, occasioned the misfortunes and shipwreck of many a noble vessel. He, I say, on the contrary, did laudably erect for a head, a goodly image of St. Nicholas, equipped with a low, broad-brimmed hat, a huge pair of Flemish trunk hose, and a pipe that reached to the end of the bowsprit. Thus gallantly furnished, the staunch ship floated sideways, like a majestic goose, out of the harbor of the great city of Amsterdam, and all the bells that were not otherwise engaged rung a triple bob major on the joyful occasion. My great-great-grandfather remarks that the voyage was uncommonly prosperous, for, being under the especial care of the ever-revered St. Nicholas, the Goede Vrouw seemed to be endowed with qualities unknown to common vessels. Thus she made as much leeway as headway, could get along very nearly as fast with the wind ahead as when it was a poop, and was particularly great in a calm, in consequence of which singular advantage she made out to accomplish her voyage in a very few months, and came to anchor at the mouth of the Hudson, a little to the east of Gibbet Island. Here, lifting up their eyes, they beheld, on what is at present called the Jersey shore, a small Indian village, pleasantly embowered in a grove of spreading elms, and the natives all collected on the beach, gazing in stupid admiration at the Goede Vrouw. A boat was immediately dispatched to enter into a treaty with them, and, approaching the shore, hailed them through a trumpet in the most friendly terms. But so horribly confounded were these poor savages at the tremendous and uncouth sound of the Low Dutch language that they one and all took to their heels and scampered over the Bergen hills. Nor did they stop until they had buried themselves, head and ears, in the marshes on the other side, where they all miserably perished to a man. And, their bones being collected and decently covered by the Tammany Society of that day, formed that singular mound called Rattlesnake Hill, which rises out of the center of the salt marshes a little to the east of the Newark Causeway. Animated by this unlooked-for victory, our valiant heroes sprang ashore in triumph, took possession of the soil as conquerors, in the name of their high mightinesses the Lord States General, and marching fearlessly forward, carried the village of Communipaw by storm, notwithstanding that it was vigorously defended by some half a score of old squaws and papooses. On looking about them, they were so transported with the excellences of the place that they had very little doubt the blessed Saint Nicholas had guided them thither as the very spot whereon to settle their colony. The softness of the soil was wonderfully adapted to the driving of piles. The swamps and marshes around them afforded ample opportunities for the constructing of dikes and dams. The shallowness of the shore was peculiarly favorable to the building of docks. In a word, this spot abounded with all the requisites for the foundation of a great Dutch city. On making a faithful report, therefore, to the crew of the Goede Vrouw, they one and all determined that this was the destined end of their voyage. Accordingly, they descended from the Goede Vrouw, men, women, and children, in goodly groups, as did the animals of yore from the ark, and formed themselves into a thriving settlement, which they called by the Indian name Communipaw. As all the world is doubtless perfectly acquainted with Communipaw, it may seem somewhat superfluous to treat of it in the present work, but my readers will please to recollect that notwithstanding it is my chief desire to satisfy the present age, yet I write likewise for posterity, and have to consult the understanding and curiosity of some half a score of centuries yet to come. By which time, perhaps, were it not for this invaluable history, the great Communipaw, like Babylon, Carthage, Nineveh, and other great cities, might be perfectly extinct, sunk and forgotten in its own mud, its inhabitants turned into oysters, and even its situation a fertile subject of learned controversy and hard-headed investigation among indefatigable historians. Let me, then, piously rescue from oblivion the humble relics of a place which was the egg from whence was hatched the mighty city of New York. Communipaw is at present but a small village, pleasantly situated among rural scenery, on that beauteous part of the Jersey shore which was known in ancient legends by the name of Pavonia, and commands a grand prospect of the superb Bay of New York. It is within but half an hour's sail of the latter place, provided you have a fair wind, and may be distinctly seen from the city. Nay, it is a well-known fact, which I can testify from my own experience, that on a clear, still summer evening you may hear from the Battery of New York the obstreperous peals of broad-mouthed laughter of the Dutch Negroes at Communipaw, who, like most other Negroes, are famous for their risible powers. This is peculiarly the case on Sunday evenings, when, it is remarked by an ingenious and observant philosopher, who has made great discoveries in the neighborhood of this city, that they always laugh loudest, which he attributes to the circumstance of their having their holiday clothes on. These Negroes, in fact, like the monks in the Dark Ages, engross all the knowledge of the place, and, being infinitely more adventurous, and more knowing than their masters, carry on all the foreign trade, making frequent voyages to town in canoes loaded with oysters, buttermilk, and cabbages. They are great astrologers, predicting the different changes of weather almost as accurately as an almanac. They are, moreover, exquisite performers on three-stringed fiddles. In whistling they almost boast the far-famed powers of Orpheus' lyre, for not a horse nor an ox in the place, when at the plough or before the wagon, will budge a foot until he hears the well-known whistle of his black driver and companion. And from their amazing skill at casting up accounts upon their fingers they are regarded with as much veneration as were the disciples of Pythagoras of yore when initiated into the sacred quaternary of numbers. As to the honest burghers of Communipaw, like wise men and sound philosophers, they never look beyond their pipes, nor trouble their heads about any affairs out of their immediate neighborhood, so that they live in profound and enviable ignorance of all the troubles, anxieties, and revolutions of this distracted planet. I am even told that many among them do verily believe that Holland, of which they have heard so much from tradition, is situated somewhere on Long Island, that Spiking Devil and the Narrows are the two ends of the world, that the country is still under the dominion of their high mightinesses, and that the city of New York still goes by the name of New Amsterdam. They meet every Saturday afternoon at the only tavern in the place, which bears as a sign a square-headed likeness of the Prince of Orange, where they smoke a silent pipe by way of promoting social conviviality, and invariably drink a mug of cider to the success of Admiral Van Tromp, whom they imagine is still sweeping the British Channel with a broom at his masthead. Communipaw, in short, is one of the numerous little villages in the vicinity of this most beautiful of cities, which are so many strongholds and fastnesses whither the primitive manners of our Dutch forefathers have retreated, and where they are cherished with devout and scrupulous strictness. The dress of the original settlers is handed down inviolate from father to son. The identical broad-brimmed hat, broad-skirted coat, and broad-bottomed breeches continue from generation to generation, and several gigantic knee-buckles of massy silver are still in wear that made gallant display in the days of the patriarchs of Communipaw. The language likewise continues unadulterated by barbarous innovations, and so critically correct is the village schoolmaster in his dialect that his reading of a Low Dutch psalm has much the same effect on the nerves as the filing of a handsaw. Chapter 3. Having in the trifling digression which concluded the last chapter discharged the filial duty which the city of New York owed to Communipaw, as being the mother settlement, and having given a faithful picture of it as it stands at present, I return with a soothing sentiment of self-approbation to dwell upon its early history. The crew of the Goede Vrouw being soon reinforced by fresh importations from Holland, the settlement went jollily on increasing in magnitude and prosperity. The neighboring Indians in a short time became accustomed to the uncouth sound of the Dutch language, and an intercourse gradually took place between them and the newcomers. The Indians were much given to long talks, and the Dutch to long silence. In this particular, therefore, they accommodated each other completely. The chiefs would make long speeches about the big bull, the Wabash, and the Great Spirit, to which the others would listen very attentively, smoke their pipes, and grunt ya amwenher, whereat the poor savages were wondrously delighted. They instructed the new settlers in the best art of curing and smoking tobacco, while the latter in return made them drunk with true Hollands, and then taught them the art of making bargains. A brisk trade for furs was soon opened. The Dutch traders were scrupulously honest in their dealings, and purchased by weight, establishing it as an invariable table of avoirdupois that the hand of a Dutchman weighed 1 pound, and his foot 2 pounds. It is true the simple Indians were often puzzled by the great disproportion between bulk and weight, for let them place a bundle of furs never so large in one scale, and a Dutchman put his hand or foot in the other, the bundle was sure to kick the beam. Never was a package of furs known to weigh more than 2 pounds in the market of Communipaw. This is a singular fact, but I have it direct from my great-great-grandfather, who had risen to considerable importance in the colony, being promoted to the office of weighmaster, on account of the uncommon heaviness of his foot. The Dutch possessions in this part of the globe began now to assume a very thriving appearance, and were comprehended under the general title of New Netherlands on account, as the sage Van der Donck observes, of their great resemblance to the Dutch Netherlands, which indeed was truly remarkable, excepting that the former was rugged and mountainous, and the latter level and marshy. About this time, the tranquility of the Dutch colonists was doomed to suffer a temporary interruption. In 1614, Captain Sir Samuel Argall, sailing under a commission from Dale, governor of Virginia, visited the Dutch settlements on Hudson River, and demanded their submission to the English crown and Virginian dominion. To this arrogant demand, as they were in no condition to resist it, they submitted for the time, like discreet and reasonable men. It does not appear that the valiant Argall molested the settlement of Communipaw. On the contrary, I am told that when his vessel first hove in sight, the worthy burghers were seized with such a panic that they fell to smoking their pipes with astonishing vehemence, insomuch that they quickly raised a cloud, which, combining with the surrounding woods and marshes, completely enveloped and concealed their beloved village, and overhung the fair regions of Pavonia, so that the terrible Captain Argall passed on, totally unsuspicious that a sturdy little Dutch settlement lay snugly couched in the mud, under cover of all this pestilent vapor. In commemoration of this fortunate escape, the worthy inhabitants have continued to smoke almost without intermission unto this very day, which is said to be the cause of the remarkable fog which often hangs over Communipaw of a clear afternoon. Upon the departure of the enemy, our magnanimous ancestors took full 6 months to recover their wind, having been exceedingly discomposed by the consternation and hurry of affairs. They then called a council of safety to smoke over the state of the provinces. At this council presided one Olaf van Kortlandt, who had originally been one of a set of peripatetic philosophers who passed much of their time sunning themselves on the side of the great canal of Amsterdam in Holland, enjoying, like Diogenes, a free and unencumbered estate in sunshine. His name Kortlandt, Shortland or Lackland, was supposed, like that of the illustrious Jean Sans Terre, to indicate that he had no land. But he insisted, on the contrary, that he had great landed estates somewhere in terra incognita, and he had come out to the New World to look after them. Like all land speculators, he was much given to dreaming. Never did anything extraordinary happen at Communipaw, but he declared that he had previously dreamt it, being one of those infallible prophets who predict events after they have come to pass. This supernatural gift was as highly valued among the burghers of Pavonia as among the enlightened nations of antiquity. The wise Ulysses was more indebted to his sleeping than his waking moments for his most subtle achievements, and seldom undertook any great exploit without first soundly sleeping upon it. And the same may be said of Olaf van Kortlandt, who was thence aptly denominated Olaf the Dreamer. As yet his dreams and speculations had turned to little personal profit, and he was as much a Lackland as ever. Still he carried a high head in the community. If his sugar-loaf hat was rather the worse for wear, he set it oft with a taller cock's tail. If his shirt was none of the cleanest, he puffed it out the more at the bosom, and if the tail of it peeped out of a hole in his breeches, it at least proved that it really had a tail and was not a mere ruffle. The worthy Van Kortlandt, in the council in question, urged the policy of emerging from the swamps of Communipaw and seeking some more eligible site for the seat of empire. Such, he said, was the advice of the good Saint Nicholas, who had appeared to him in a dream the night before, and whom he had known by his broad hat, his long pipe, and the resemblance which he bore to the figure on the bow of the Goede Vrouw. Many have thought this dream was a mere invention of Olaf van Kortlandt, who, it is said, had ever regarded Communipaw with an evil eye, because he had arrived there after all the land had been shared out, and who was anxious to change the seat of empire to some new place, where he might be present at the distribution of town lots. But we must not give heed to such insinuations, which are too apt to be advanced against those worthy gentlemen engaged in laying out towns and in other land speculations. This perilous enterprise was to be conducted by Olaf himself, who chose as lieutenants or coadjutors Mynheers Abraham Hardenbroek, Jacobus van Zandt, and Wijnant ten Broek, 3 indubitably great men, but of whose history, although I have made diligent inquiry, I can learn but little previous to their leaving Holland. Nor need this occasion much surprise, for adventurers, like prophets, though they make great noise abroad, have seldom much celebrity in their own countries. But this much is certain, that the overflowings and offscourings of a country are invariably composed of the richest parts of the soil. And here I cannot help remarking how convenient it would be to many of our great men and great families of doubtful origin, could they have the privilege of the heroes of yore, who, whenever their origin was involved in obscurity, modestly announced themselves descended from a god, and who never visited a foreign country but what they told some cock-and-bull stories about there being kings and princes at home. This venal trespass on the truth, though it has been occasionally played off by some pseudo-marquis, baronet, and other illustrious foreigner, in our land of good-natured credulity, has been completely discountenanced in this skeptical, matter-of-fact age. And I even question whether any tender virgin, who was accidentally and unaccountably enriched with a bantling, would save her character at parlor firesides and evening tea parties by ascribing the phenomenon to a swan, a shower of gold, or a river god. Had I the benefit of mythology and classic fable above alluded to, I should have furnished the first of the trio with a pedigree equal to that of the proudest hero of antiquity. His name, Van Zandt, that is to say, from the dirt, gave reasons to suppose that, like Triptolemus, Themis, the Cyclops, and the Titans, he had sprung from Dame Terra or the earth. This supposition is strongly corroborated by his size, for it is well known that all the progeny of Mother Earth were of a gigantic stature. And Van Zandt, we are told, was a tall, raw-boned man, above 6 feet high, with an astonishingly hard head. Nor is this origin of the illustrious Van Zandt a whit more improbable or repugnant to belief than what is related and universally admitted of certain of our greatest, or rather richest, men, who we are told with the utmost gravity did originally spring from a dunghill. Of the second of the trio but faint accounts have reached to this time, which mention that he was a sturdy, obstinate, worrying, bustling little man, and, from being usually equipped in an old pair of buckskins, was familiarly dubbed Hardenbroek or Tough Breeches. 10 Broek completed this junto of adventurers. It is a singular but ludicrous fact, which, were I not scrupulous in recording the whole truth, I should almost be tempted to pass over in silence, as incompatible with the gravity and dignity of history, that this worthy gentleman should likewise have been nicknamed from what in modern times is considered the most ignoble part of the dress. But, in truth, the small clothes seems to have been a very dignified garment in the eyes of our venerated ancestors, in all probability from its covering that part of the body which has been pronounced the seat of honor. The name of ten broke, or, as it was sometimes spelt, tin broke, has been indifferently translated into ten breeches and tin breeches. The most elegant and ingenious writers on the subject declare in favor of tin, or rather thin, breeches, whence they infer that the original bearer of it was a poor but merry rogue, whose galligaskins were none of the soundest, and who, peradventure, may have been the author of that truly philosophical stanza. Then why should we quarrel for riches, or any such glittering toys? A light heart and thin pair of breeches will go through the world, my brave boys. The High Dutch commentators, however, declare in favor of the other reading, and affirm that the worthy in question was a burly, bulbous man, who, in sheer ostentation of his venerable progenitors, was the first to introduce into the settlement the ancient Dutch fashion of 10 pair of breeches. Such was the trio of coadjutors chosen by Olaf the Dreamer to accompany him in this voyage into unknown realms. As to the names of his crews, they have not been handed down by history. Having, as I before observed, passed much of his life in the open air, among the peripatetic philosophers of Amsterdam, Olaf had become familiar with the aspect of the heavens, and could as accurately determine when a storm was brewing or a squall rising as a dutiful husband can foresee, from the brow of his spouse, when a tempest is gathering about his ears. Having pitched upon a time for his voyage, when the skies appeared propitious, he exhorted all his crews to take a good night's rest, wind up their family affairs, and make their wills. Precautions taken by our forefathers, even in after times when they became more adventurous, and voyaged to Haverstraw or Catskill or Grootisopus or any other far country, beyond the great waters of the Tappan Zee. Chapter 4. And now the rosy blush of morn began to mantle in the east, and soon the rising sun, emerging from amidst golden and purple clouds, shed his blithesome rays on the tin weathercocks of Communipaw. It was that delicious season of the year when nature, breaking from the chilling thraldom of old winter, like a blooming damsel from the tyranny of a sordid old father, threw herself, blushing with 10,000 charms, into the arms of youthful spring. Every tufted copse and blooming grove resounded with the notes of hymeneal love. The very insects, as they sipped the dew that gemmed the tender grass of the meadows, joined in the joyous epithalamium. The virgin bud timidly put forth its blushes. The voice of the turtle was heard in the land, and the heart of man dissolved away in tenderness. O sweet Theocritus, had I thine oaten reed, wherewith thou erst did charm the gay Sicilian plains, or, O gentle Bion, thy pastoral pipe wherein the happy swains of the Lesbian Isle so much delighted, then might I attempt to sing, in soft bucolic or negligent idyllium, the rural beauties of the scene. But having nothing, save this jaded goosequill, wherewith to wing my flight, I must fain resign all poetic disportings of the fancy, and pursue my narrative in humble prose, comforting myself with the hope that though it may not steal so sweetly upon the imagination of my reader, yet it may commend itself, with virgin modesty, to his better judgment, clothed in the chaste and simple garb of truth. No sooner did the first rays of cheerful Phoebus dart into the windows of Communipaw than the little settlement was all in motion. Forth issued from his castle the sage Van Cortlandt, and seizing a conch shell, blew a far-resounding blast, that soon summoned all his lusty followers. Then did they trudge resolutely down to the waterside, escorted by a multitude of relatives and friends, who all went down, as the common phrase expresses it, to see them off. And this shows the antiquity of those long family processions, often seen in our city, composed of all ages, sizes, and sexes, laden with bundles and bandboxes, escorting some bevy of country cousins about to depart for home in a market-boat. The good Olaf bestowed his forces in a squadron of 3 canoes, and hoisted his flag on board a little round Dutch boat, shaped not unlike a tub, which had formerly been the jolly boat of the Goede Vrouw. And now, all being embarked, they bade farewell to the gazing throng upon the beach, who continued shouting after them, even when out of hearing, wishing them a happy voyage, advising them to take good care of themselves, not to get drowned, with an abundance of other of those sage and invaluable cautions generally given by landsmen to such as go down to the sea in ships, and adventure upon the deep waters. In the meanwhile the voyagers cheerily urged their course across the crystal bosom of the bay, and soon left behind them the green shores of ancient Pavonia. And first they touched at two small islands which lie nearly opposite Communipaw, and which are said to have been brought into existence about the time of the great eruption of the Hudson, when it broke through the highlands and made its way to the ocean. For, in this tremendous uproar of the waters we are told that many huge fragments of rock and land were rent from the mountains and swept down by this runaway river, for 60 or 70 miles, where some of them ran aground on the shoals just opposite Communipaw, and formed the identical islands in question, while others drifted out to sea and were never heard of more. A sufficient proof of the fact is, that the rock which forms the bases of these islands is exactly similar to that of the highlands. And moreover, one of our philosophers, who has diligently compared the agreement of their respective surfaces, has even gone so far as to assure me, in confidence, that Gibbet Island was originally nothing more nor less than a wart on Anthony's nose. Leaving these wonderful little isles, they next coasted by Governor's Island, since terrible from its frowning fortress and grinning batteries. They would by no means, however, land upon this island, since they doubted much it might be the abode of demons and spirits, which in those days did greatly abound throughout this savage and pagan country. Just at this time a shoal of jolly porpoises came rolling and tumbling by, turning up their sleek sides to the sun, and spouting up the briny element in sparkling showers. No sooner did the sage aloft mark this than he was greatly rejoiced. "This," exclaimed he, "if I mistake not, augurs well. The porpoise is a fat, well-conditioned fish, a burgomaster among fishes. His looks betoken ease, plenty, and prosperity. I greatly admire this round fat fish, and doubt not but this is a happy omen of the success of our undertaking." So saying, he directed his squadron to steer in the track of these alderman fishes. Turning, therefore, directly to the left, they swept up the strait, vulgarly called the East River. And here the rapid tide which courses through the strait, seizing on the gallant tub in which Commodore Van Cortlandt had embarked, hurried it forward with a velocity unparalleled in a Dutch boat, navigated by Dutchmen. Insomuch that the good Commodore, who had all his life long been accustomed only to the drowsy navigation of canals, was more than ever convinced that they were in the hands of some supernatural power, and that the jolly porpoises were towing them to some fair haven that was to fulfill all their wishes and expectations. Thus borne away by the resistless current, they doubled that boisterous point of land since called Corlear's Hook, and leaving to the right the rich winding cove of the Wallabout, they drifted into a magnificent expanse of water, surrounded by pleasant shores, whose verdure was exceedingly refreshing to the eye. While the voyagers were looking around them, on what they conceived to be a serene and sunny lake, they beheld at a distance a crew of painted savages busily employed in fishing, who seemed more like the genii of this romantic region, their slender canoe lightly balanced like a feather on the undulating surface of the bay. At sight of these the hearts of the heroes of Communipaw were not a little troubled. But as good fortune would have it, at the bow of the Commodore's boat was stationed a valiant man, named Diedrich Kip, which, being interpreted, means chicken, a name given him in token of his courage. No sooner did he behold these varlet heathens, than he trembled with excessive valor, and although a good half-mile distant, he seized a musketoon that lay at hand, and turning away his head, fired it most intrepidly in the face of the blessed sun. The blundering weapon recoiled, and gave the valiant Kip an ignominious kick, which laid him prostrate with uplifted heels in the bottom of the boat. But such was the effect of this tremendous fire, that the wild men of the woods, struck with consternation, seized hastily upon their paddles, and shot away into one of the deep inlets of the long island shore. This signal victory gave new spirits to the voyagers, and in honor of the achievement they gave the name of the valiant Kip to the surrounding bay, and it has continued to be called Kip's Bay from that time to the present. The heart of the good Van Cortlandt, who, having no land of his own, was a great admirer of other people's, expanded to the full size of a peppercorn at the sumptuous prospect of rich, unsettled country around him, and falling into a delicious reverie, he straightway began to riot in the possession of vast meadows of salt marsh and interminable patches of cabbages. From this delectable vision he was all at once awakened by the sudden turning of the tide, which would soon have hurried him from this land of promise, had not the discreet navigator given signal to steer for shore, where they accordingly landed hard by the rocky heights of Bellevue, that happy retreat where our jolly aldermen eat for the good of the city, and fatten the turtle that are sacrificed on civic solemnities. Here, seated on the greensward, by the side of a small stream that ran sparkling among the grass, they refreshed themselves after the toils of the seas by feasting lustily on the ample stores which they had provided for this perilous voyage. Thus, having well fortified their deliberate powers, they fell into an earnest consultation what was further to be done. This was the first council dinner ever eaten at Bellevue by Christian burghers, and here, as tradition relates, did originate the great family feud between the Hardenbrokes and the Tenbrokes, which afterwards had a singular influence on the building of the city. The sturdy Hardenbroke, whose eyes had been wondrously delighted with the salt marshes which spread their reeking bosoms along the coast, at the bottom of Kip's Bay, counseled by all means to return thither, and found the intended city. This was strenuously opposed by the unbending Tenbroke, and many testy arguments passed between them. The particulars of this controversy have not reached us, which is ever to be lamented. This much is certain, that the sage aloft put an end to the dispute, by determining to explore still farther in the route which the mysterious porpoises had so clearly pointed out, whereupon the sturdy tough breeches abandoned the expedition, took possession of a neighboring hill, and in a fit of great wrath peopled all that tract of country, which has continued to be inhabited by the Hardenbrokes unto this very day. By this time the jolly Phoebus, like some wanton urchin sporting on the side of a green hill, began to roll down the declivity of the heavens. And now, the tide having once more turned in their favor, the Pavonians again committed themselves to its discretion, and coasting along the western shores, were borne towards the straits of Blackwell's Island. And here the capricious wanderings of the current occasioned not a little marvel and perplexity to these illustrious mariners. Now would they be caught by the wanton eddies, and sweeping round a jutting point, would wind deep into some romantic little cove that indented the fair island of Mannahato. Now were they hurried narrowly by the very bases of impending rocks, mantled with the flaunting grapevine, and crowned with groves, which threw a broad shade on the waves beneath, and anon they were borne away into the mid-channel and wafted along with a rapidity that very much discomposed the sage Van Cortlandt, who, as he saw the land swiftly receding on either side, began exceedingly to doubt that terra firma was giving them the slip. Wherever the voyagers turned their eyes, a new creation seemed to bloom around. No signs of human thrift appeared to check the delicious wildness of nature, who here reveled in all her luxuriant variety. Those hills, now bristled like the fretful porcupine, with rows of poplars, vain upstart plants, minions of wealth and fashion, were then adorned with the vigorous natives of the soil, the lordly oak, the generous chestnut, the graceful elm, while here and there the tulip tree reared its majestic head, the giant of the forest. Where now are seen the gay retreats of luxury, villas half buried in twilight bowers, whence the amorous flute oft breathes the sighings of some city swain. There the fishhawk built his solitary nest, on some dry tree that overlooked his watery domain. The timid deer fed undisturbed along those shores now hallowed by the lover's moonlight walk, and printed by the slender foot of beauty, and a savage solitude extended over those happy regions, where now are reared the stately towers of the Joneses, the Schermerhorns, and the Rhinelanders. Thus gliding in silent wonder through these new and unknown scenes, the gallant squadron of Pavonia swept by the foot of a promontory, which strutted forth boldly into the waves, and seemed to frown upon them as they brawled against its base. This is the bluff well known to modern mariners by the name of Gracie's Point, from the fair castle which, like an elephant, it carries upon its back. And here broke upon their view a wild and varied prospect, where land and water were beauteously intermingled, as though they had combined to heighten and set off each other's charms. To their right lay the sedgy point of Blackwell's Island, dressed in the fresh garniture of living green. Beyond it stretched the pleasant coast of Sunswick and the small harbor well known by the name of Hallett's Cove, a place infamous in latter days, by reason of its being the haunt of pirates who infest these seas, robbing orchards and watermelon patches, and insulting gentlemen navigators when voyaging in their pleasure boats. To the left a deep bay, or rather creek, gracefully receded between shores fringed with forests, and forming a kind of vista through which were beheld the sylvan regions of Haarlem, Morrisania, and East Chester. Here the eye reposed with delight on a richly weeded country, diversified by tufted knolls, shadowy intervals, and waving lines of upland, swelling above each other. while over the whole the purple mists of spring diffused a hue of soft voluptuousness. Just before them the grand course of the stream, making a sudden bend, wound among embowered promontories and shores of emerald verdure that seemed to melt into the wave. A character of gentleness and mild fertility prevailed around. The sun had just descended, and the thin haze of twilight, like a transparent veil drawn over the bosom of virgin beauty, heightened the charms which it half concealed. Ah, witching scenes of foul delusion! Ah, hapless voyagers, gazing with simple wonder on these Circean shores. Such, alas, are they, poor easy souls, who listen to the seductions of a wicked world. Treacherous are its smiles, fatal its caresses. He who yields to its enticements launches upon a whelming tide, and trusts his feeble bark among the dimpling eddies of a whirlpool. And thus it fared with the worthies of Pavonia, who, little mistrusting the guileful sense before them, drifted quietly on, until they were aroused by an uncommon tossing and agitation of their vessels. For now the late dimpling current began to brawl around them, and the waves to boil and foam with horrible fury. Awakened as if from a dream, the astonished aloft bawled aloud to put about, but his words were lost amid the roaring of the waters. And now ensued a scene of direful consternation. At one time they were borne with dreadful velocity among tumultuous breakers, at another hurried down boisterous rapids. Now they were nearly dashed upon the hen and chickens, infamous rocks, more voracious than Scylla and her whelps, and anon they seemed sinking into yawning gulfs that threatened to entomb them beneath the waves. All the elements combined to produce a hideous confusion. The waters raged, the winds howled, and as they were hurried along several of the astonished mariners beheld the rocks and trees of the neighboring shores driving through the air. At length the mighty tub of Commodore Van Cortlandt was drawn into the vortex of that tremendous whirlpool called the Pot, where it was whirled about in giddy mazes, until the senses of the good commander and his crew were overpowered by the horror of the scene and the strangeness of the revolution. How the gallant squadron of Pavonia was snatched from the jaws of this modern Charybdis has never been truly made known, for so many survived to tell the tale, and, what is still more wonderful, told it in so many different ways, that there has ever prevailed a great variety of opinions on the subject. As to the Commodore and his crew, when they came to their senses they found themselves stranded on the Long Island shore. The worthy Commodore, indeed, used to relate many and wonderful stories of his adventures in this time of peril. How that he saw specters flying in the air, and heard the yelling of hobgoblins, and put his hand into the pot when they were whirled round, and found the water scalding hot, and beheld several uncouth-looking beings seated on rocks and skimming it with huge ladles. But particularly he declared with great exultation that he saw the lozal porpoises, which had betrayed them into this peril, some broiling on the gridiron, and others hissing on the frying-pan. These, however, were considered by many as mere fantasies of the Commodore, while he lay in a trance, especially as he was known to be given to dreaming, and the truth of them has never been clearly ascertained. It is certain, however, that to the accounts of Olaf and his followers may be traced the various traditions handed down of this marvelous strait, as how the devil has been seen there, sitting astride of the hog's back and playing on the fiddle, how he broils fish there before a storm, and many other stories in which we must be cautious of putting too much faith. In consequence of all these terrific circumstances, the Pavonian commander gave this pass the name of Heligat, or, as it has been interpreted, Hellgate, which it continues to bear at the present day. Chapter 5. The darkness of night had closed upon this disastrous day, and a doleful night was it to the shipwrecked Pavonians, whose ears were incessantly assailed with the raging of the elements, and the howling of the hobgoblins that infested this perfidious strait. But when the morning dawned the horrors of the preceding evening had passed away. Rapids, breakers, and whirlpools had disappeared. The stream again ran smooth and dimpling, and having changed its tide, rolled gently back towards the quarter where lay their much-regretted home. The woebegone heroes of Communipaw eyed each other with rueful countenances. Their squadrons had been totally dispersed by the late disaster. Some were cast upon the western shore, where, headed by one Rulef Hopper, they took possession of all the country lying about the 6-milestone, which is held by the Hoppers at this present writing. The Waldrons were driven by stress of weather to a distant coast, where, having with them a jug of genuine Hollands, they were enabled to conciliate the savages, setting up a kind of tavern, whence, it is said, did spring the fair town of Haarlem, in which their descendants have ever since continued to be reputable publicans. As to the Suddams, they were thrown upon the Long Island coast, and may still be found in those parts. But the most singular luck attended the great Ten Broeck, who, falling overboard, was miraculously preserved from sinking by the multitude of his nether garments. Thus buoyed up, he floated on the waves like a merman, or like an angler's dauber, until he landed safely on a rock, where he was found the next morning busily drying his many breeches in the sunshine. I forbear to treat of the long consultation of Olaf with his remaining followers, in which they determined that it would never do to found a city in so diabolical a neighborhood. Suffice it in simple brevity to say, that they once more committed themselves, with fear and trembling, to the briny element, and steered their course back again through the scenes of their yesterday's voyage, determined no longer to roam in search of distant sights, but to settle themselves down in the marshy regions of Pavonia. Scarce, however, had they gained a distant view of Communipaw, when they were encountered by an obstinate eddy, which opposed their homeward voyage. Weary and dispirited as they were, they yet tugged a feeble or against the stream, until, as if to settle the strife, half a score of potent billows rolled the tub of Commodore Van Cortlandt high and dry on the long point of an island which divided the bosom of the bay. Some pretend that these billows were sent by old Neptune to strand the expedition on a spot whereon was to be founded his stronghold in this western world. Others, more pious, attribute everything to the guardianship of the good Saint Nicholas, and after events will be found to corroborate this opinion. Olaf Van Cortlandt was a devout trencherman. Every repast was a kind of religious rite with him, and his first thought on finding him once more on dry ground was how he should contrive to celebrate his wonderful escape from Hellgate and all its horrors by a solemn banquet. The stores which had been provided for the voyage by the good housewives of Communipaw were nearly exhausted, but in casting his eyes about the Commodore beheld that the shore abounded with oysters. A great store of these was instantly collected. A fire was made at the foot of a tree. All hands fell to roasting and broiling and stewing and frying, and a sumptuous repast was soon set forth. This is thought to be the origin of those civic feasts with which, to the present day, all our public affairs are celebrated, and in which the oyster is ever sure to play an important part. On the present occasion the worthy Van Cortlandt was observed to be particularly zealous in his devotions to the trencher, for having the cares of the expedition especially committed to his care, he deemed it incumbent on him to eat profoundly for the public good. In proportion as he filled himself to the very brim with the dainty viands before him did the heart of this excellent burgher rise up towards his throat, until he seemed crammed and almost choked with good eating and good nature. And at such times it is, when a man's heart is in his throat, that he may more truly be said to speak from it, and his speeches abound with kindness and good fellowship. Thus, having swallowed the last possible morsel, and washed it down with a fervent potation, Olaf felt his heart yearning, and his whole frame in a manner dilating with unbounded benevolence. Everything around him seemed excellent and delightful, and laying his hands on each side of his capacious periphery, and rolling his half-closed eyes around on the beautiful diversity of land and water before him, he exclaimed, in a fat, half-smothered voice, "What a charming prospect!" The words died away in his throat. He seemed to ponder on the fair scene for a moment. His eyelids heavily closed over their orbs. His head drooped upon his bosom. He slowly sank upon the green turf, and a deep sleep stole gradually over him. And the sage Olaf dreamed a dream, and lo! The good street Nicholas came riding over the tops of the trees, in that selfsame wagon wherein he brings his yearly presents to children. And he descended hard by where the heroes of Communipaw had made their late repast. And he lit his pipe by the fire, and sat himself down and smoked. And as he smoked the smoke from his pipe ascended into the air, and spread like a cloud overhead. And Olaf bethought him, and he hastened and climbed up to the top of one of the tallest trees, and saw that the smoke spread over a great extent of country. And as he considered it more attentively he fancied that the great volume of smoke assumed a variety of marvelous forms, where in dim obscurity he saw shadowed out palaces and domes and lofty spires, all of which lasted but a moment, and then faded away until the whole rolled off, and nothing but the green woods were left. And when Street Nicholas had smoked his pipe he twisted it in his hatband, and laying his finger beside his nose, gave the astonished Van Cortlandt a very significant look. Then mounting his wagon, he returned over the treetops and disappeared. And Van Cortlandt awoke from his sleep greatly instructed, and he aroused his companions, and related to them his dream, and interpreted it that it was the will of St. Nicholas that they should settle down and build the city here, and that the smoke of the pipe was a type how vast would be the extent of the city, inasmuch as the volumes of its smoke would spread over a wide extent of country. And they all with one voice assented to this interpretation excepting Mynheer ten Broek, who declared the meaning to be that it would be a city wherein a little fire would occasion a great smoke, or, in other words, a very vaporing little city, both which interpretations have strangely come to pass. The great object of their perilous expedition, therefore, being thus happily accomplished, the voyagers returned merrily to Communipaw, where they were received with great rejoicings. And here calling a general meeting of all the wise men and the dignitaries of Pavonia, they related the whole history of their voyage, and of the dream of Olaf van Kortlandt. And the people lifted up their voices and blessed the good St. Nicholas, and from that time forth the sage van Kortlandt was held in more honor than ever, for his great talent at dreaming, and was pronounced a most useful citizen, and a right good man when he was asleep. Chapter 6. The original name of the island whereon the squadron of Communipaw was thus propitiously thrown is a matter of some dispute, and has already undergone considerable vitiation, a melancholy proof of the instability of all sublunary things, and the vanity of all our hopes of lasting fame. For who can expect his name will live to posterity, when even the names of mighty islands are thus soon lost in contradiction and uncertainty? The name most current at the present day, and which is likewise countenanced by the great historian Van der Donck, is Manhattan, which is said to have originated in a custom among the squaws, in the early settlement, of wearing men's hats, as is still done among many tribes. Hence, as we are told by an old governor who was somewhat of a wag, and flourished almost a century since, and had paid a visit to the wits of Philadelphia, hence arose the appellation of Manhattan, first given to the Indians and afterwards to the island, a stupid joke, but well enough for a governor. Among the more venerable sources of information on this subject is that valuable history of the American possessions, written by Master Richard Blome in 1687, wherein it is called the Manhatties and Manahainant. Nor must I forget the excellent little book, full of precious matter, of that authentic historian John Jocelyn Gent, who expressly calls it Manadas. Another etymology still more ancient, and sanctioned by the countenance of our ever-to-be-lamented Dutch ancestors, is that found in certain letters, still extant, which passed between the early governors and their neighboring powers, wherein it is called indifferently Manhattos, Manhattos, and Manhattos, which are evidently unimportant variations of the same name. For our wise forefathers set little store by those niceties, either in orthography or orthoepy, which form the sole study and ambition of many learned men and women of this hypercritical age. This last name is said to be derived from the great Indian spirit Manetho, who was supposed to make this island his favored abode, on account of its uncommon delights. For the Indian traditions affirm that the bay was once a translucid lake, filled with silver and golden fish, in the midst of which lay this beautiful island, covered with every variety of fruits and flowers, but that the sudden eruption of the Hudson laid waste these blissful scenes, and Manetho took his flight beyond the great waters of Ontario. These, however, are very fabulous legends, to which very cautious credence must be given, and though I am willing to admit the last quoted orthography of the name is very fit for prose, yet is there another which I peculiarly delight in as at once poetical, melodious, and significant, and which we have on the authority of Master Juet, who, in his account of the voyage of the great Hudson, calls this Mannahatta, that is to say, the island of Manna, or, in other words, a land flowing with milk and honey. Still my deference to the learned obliges me to notice the opinion of the worthy Dominie Heckwelder, which ascribes the name to a great drunken bout, held on the island by the Dutch discoverers, whereat they made certain of the natives most ecstatically drunk for the first time in their lives, who, being delighted with their jovial entertainment, gave the place the name of Manhattanink, that is to say, the island of jolly topers, a name which it continues to merit to the present day. Chapter 7. It having been solemnly resolved that the seat of empire should be removed from the green shores of Pavonia to the pleasant island of Mannahatta, everybody was anxious to embark under the standard of Olaf the Dreamer, and to be among the first sharers of the promised land. A day was appointed for the grand migration, and on that day little Communipaw as in a buzz and a bustle like a hive in swarming time. Houses were turned inside out, and stripped of the venerable furniture which had come from Holland. All the community, great and small, black and white, man, woman, and child, was in commotion, forming lines from the houses to the waterside, like lines of ants from an anthill. Everybody laden with some article of household furniture, while busy housewives plied backwards and forwards along the lines, helping everything forward by the nimbleness of their tongues. By degrees a fleet of boats and canoes were piled up with all kinds of household articles. Ponderous tables, chests of drawers, resplendent with brass ornaments, quaint corner cupboards, beds and bedsteads, with any quantity of pots, kettles, frying pans, and Dutch ovens. In each boat embarked a whole family, from the robustious burgher down to the cats and dogs and little Negroes. In this way they set off across the mouth of the Hudson, under the guidance of Olaf the Dreamer, who hoisted his standard on the leading boat. This memorable migration took place on the 1st of May, and was long cited in tradition as the Grand Moving. The anniversary of it was piously observed among the sons of the pilgrims of Communipaw. By turning their houses topsy-turvy, and carrying all the furniture through the streets, in emblem of the swarming of the parent hive. And this is the real origin of the universal agitation and moving, by which this most restless of cities is literally turned out of doors on every May Day. As the little squadron from Communipaw drew near to the shores of Mannahatta, a sachem, at the head of a band of warriors, appeared to oppose their landing. Some of the most zealous of the pilgrims were for chastising this insolence with the powder and ball, according to the approved mode of discoverers. But the sage Olaf gave them the significant sign of St. Nicholas, laying his finger beside his nose and winking hard with one eye, whereupon his followers perceived that there was something sagacious in the wind. He now addressed the Indians in the blandest terms, and made such tempting display of beads, hawks' bells, and red blankets, that he was soon permitted to land, and a great land speculation ensued. And here let me give the true story of the original purchase of the site of this renowned city, about which so much has been said and written. Some affirm that the first cost was but 60 guilders. The learned Dominie Heckwelder records a tradition that the Dutch discoverers bargained for only so much land as the hide of a bullock would cover, but that they cut the hide in strips no thicker than a child's finger, so as to take in a large portion of land, and to take in the Indians into the bargain. This, however, is an old fable which the worthy Dominie may have borrowed from antiquity. The true version is that Olaf van Cortlandt bargained for just so much land as a man could cover with his nether garments. The terms being concluded, he produced his friend Meneer ten Broek, as the man whose breeches were to be used in measurement. The simple savages, whose ideas of a man's nether garments had never expanded beyond the dimensions of a breech-clout, stared with astonishment and dismay as they beheld this bulbous-bottomed burgher peeled like an onion, and breeches after breeches spread forth over the land until they covered the actual site of this venerable city. This is the true history of the adroit bargain by which the island of Manhattan was bought for 60 guilders, and in corroboration of it I will add that Meneer ten Breeches, for his services on this memorable occasion, was elevated to the office of land measurer, which he ever afterwards exercised in the colony. Chapter 8. The land being thus fairly purchased of the Indians, a circumstance very unusual in the history of colonization, and strongly illustrative of the honesty of our Dutch progenitors, a stockade fort and trading house were forthwith erected on an eminence in front of the place where the good St. Nicholas had appeared in a vision to Olaf the Dreamer, and which, as has already been observed, was the identical place at present known as the Bowling Green. Around this fort a progeny of little Dutch-built houses, with tiled roofs and weathercocks, soon sprang up, nestling themselves under its walls for protection, as a brood of half-fledged chickens nestle under the wings of the mother hen. The whole was surrounded by an enclosure of strong palisadoes, to guard against any sudden eruption of the savages. Outside of these extended the cornfields and cabbage gardens of the community, with here and there an attempt at a tobacco plantation, all covering those tracts of country at present called Broadway, Wall Street, William Street, and Pearl Street. I must not omit to mention that in portioning out the land a goodly bowery or farm was allotted to the sage Olaf, in consideration of the service he had rendered to the public by his talent at dreaming, and the site of his bowery is known by the name of Cortlandt or Cortland Street to the present day. And now the infant settlement having advanced in age and stature, it was thought high time it should receive an honest Christian name. Hitherto it had gone by the original Indian name of Mannahatta, or, as some will have it, the Manhattoes. But this was now decried as savage and heathenish, and as tending to keep up the memory of the pagan brood that originally possessed it. Many were the consultations held upon the subject without coming to a conclusion, for though everybody condemned the old name, nobody could invent a new one. At length, when the council was almost in despair, a burgher, remarkable for the size and squareness of his head, proposed that they should call it New Amsterdam. The proposition took everybody by surprise. It was so striking, so apposite, so ingenious. The name was adopted by acclamation, and New Amsterdam, the metropolis, was thenceforth called. Still, however, the early authors of the province continued to call it by the general appellation of the Manhattoes, and the poets fondly clung to the euphonious name of Mannahatta. But those are a kind of folk whose tastes and notions should go for nothing in matters of this kind. Having thus provided the embryo city with a name, the next was to give it an armorial bearing or device, as some cities have a rampant lion, others a soaring eagle, emblematical, no doubt, of the valiant and high-flying qualities of the inhabitants. So after mature deliberation, a sleek beaver was emblazoned on the city standard as indicative of the amphibious origin and patient persevering habits of the New Amsterdammers. The thriving state of the settlement and the rapid increase of houses soon made it necessary to arrange some plan upon which the city should be built. But at the very first consultation on the subject a violent discussion arose, and I mention it with much sorrowing as being the first altercation on record in the councils of New Amsterdam. It was, in fact, a breaking forth of the grudge and heartburning that had existed between those two eminent burghers, Mynheers ten Broek and Harden Broek, ever since their unhappy dispute on the coast of Bellevue. The great Harden Broek had waxed very wealthy and powerful from his domains, which embraced the whole chain of Apulian mountains that stretched along the Gulf of Kips Bay, and from part of which his descendants have been expelled in latter ages by the powerful clans of the Joneses and the Schermerhorns. An ingenious plan for the city was offered by Mynheer Harden Broek, who proposed that it should be cut up and intersected by canals, after the manner of the most admired cities in Holland. To this Mynheer ten Broek was diametrically opposed, suggesting in place thereof that they should run out docks and wharves, by means of piles driven into the bottom of the river, on which the town should be built. By these means, said he triumphantly, shall we rescue a considerable space of territory from these immense rivers, and build a city that shall rival Amsterdam, Venice, or any amphibious city in Europe. To this proposition Harden Broek, or Tough Breeches, replied, with a look of as much scorn as he could possibly assume. He cast the utmost censure upon the plan of his antagonist, as being preposterous, and against the very order of things, as he would leave to every true Hollander. For what, said he, is a town without canals? It is like a body without veins and arteries, and must perish for want of a free circulation of the vital fluid. Ten Breeches, on the contrary, retorted with a sarcasm upon his antagonist, who was somewhat of an arid, dry-boated habit. He remarked that as to the circulation of the blood being necessary to existence, Mynheer Tough Breeches was a living contradiction to his own assertion. For everybody knew there had not a drop of blood circulated through his wind-dried carcass for good 10 years, and yet there was not a greater busybody in the whole colony. Personalities have seldom much effect in making converts in argument, nor have I ever seen a man convinced of error by being convicted of deformity. At least such was not the case at present. If Ten Breeches was very happy in sarcasm, Tough Breeches, who was a sturdy little man, and never gave up the last word, rejoined with increasing spirit. Ten Breeches had the advantage of the greatest volubility, but Tough Breeches had that invaluable coat of mail in argument called obstinacy. Ten Breeches had, therefore, the most metal, but Tough Breeches the best bottom, so that though Ten Breeches made a dreadful clattering about his ears, and battered and belabored him with hard words and sound arguments, yet Tough Breeches hung on most resolutely to the last. They parted, therefore, as is usual in all arguments where both parties are in the right, without coming to any conclusion. But they hated each other most heartily for ever after, and a similar breach with that between the houses of Capulet and Montague did ensue between the families of Ten Breeches and Tough Breeches. I would not fatigue my reader with these dull matters of fact, but that my duty as a faithful historian requires that I should be particular. And, in truth, as I am now treating of the critical period when our city, like a young twig, first received the twists and turns which have since contributed to give it its present picturesque irregularity, I cannot be too minute in detailing their first causes. After the unhappy altercation I have just mentioned, I do not find that anything further was said on the subject worthy of being recorded. The council, consisting of the largest and oldest heads in the community, met regularly once a week to ponder on this momentous subject. But either they were deterred by the war of words they had witnessed, or they were naturally averse to the exercise of the tongue, and the consequent exercise of the brains. Certain it is, the most profound silence was maintained. The question, as usual, lay on the table. The members quietly smoked their pipes, making but few laws, without ever enforcing any. And in the meantime the affairs of the settlement went on, as it pleased God. As most of the council were but little skilled in the mystery of combining pothooks and hangers, they determined most judiciously not to puzzle either themselves or posterity with voluminous records. The secretary, however, kept the minutes of the council with tolerable precision, in a large vellum folio, fastened with massy brass clasps. The journal of each meeting consisted but of 2 lines, stating in Dutch that the council sat this day, and smoked 12 pipes on the affairs of the colony, by which it appears that the first settlers did not regulate their time by hours, but pipes, in the same manner as they measure distances in Holland at this very time. An admirably exact measurement, as a pipe in the mouth of a true-born Dutchman is never liable to those accidents and irregularities that are continually putting our clocks out of order. In this manner did the profound council of New Amsterdam smoke, and doze and ponder, from week to week, month to month, and year to year, in what manner they should construct their infant settlement. Meanwhile the town took care of itself, and like a sturdy brat which is suffered to run about wild, unshackled by clouts and bandages, and other abominations by which your notable nurses and sage old women cripple and disfigure the children of men, increased so rapidly in strength and magnitude, that before the honest burgomasters had determined upon a plan it was too late to put it in execution, whereupon they wisely abandoned the subject altogether. Chapter 9. There is something exceedingly delusive in thus looking back, through the long vista of departed years, and catching a glimpse of the fairy realms of antiquity. Like a landscape melting into distance, they receive 1,000 charms from their very obscurity, and the fancy delights to fill up their outlines with graces and excellences of its own creation. Thus loom on my imagination those happier days of our city, when as yet New Amsterdam was a mere pastoral town, shrouded in groves of sycamores and willows, and surrounded by trackless forests and wide-spreading waters, that seemed to shut out all the cares and vanities of a wicked world. In those days did this embryo city present the rare and noble spectacle of a community governed without laws, and thus being left to its own course, and the fostering care of Providence, increased as rapidly as though it had been burdened with a dozen panniers full of those sage laws usually heaped on the backs of young cities, in order to make them grow. And in this particular I greatly admire the wisdom and sound knowledge of human nature displayed by the sage Aloft the Dreamer and his fellow legislators. For my part, I have not so bad an opinion of mankind as many of my brother philosophers. I do not think poor human nature so sorry a piece of workmanship as they would make it out to be, and as far as I have observed, I am fully satisfied that man, if left to himself, would about as readily go right as wrong. It is only this eternally sounding in his ears that it is his duty to go right which makes him go the very reverse. The noble independence of his nature revolts at this intolerable tyranny of law, and the perpetual interference of officious morality, which are ever besetting his path with finger-posts and directions to keep to the right, as the law directs. And like a spirited urchin, he turns directly contrary, and gallops through mud and mire, over hedges and ditches, merely to show that he is a lad of spirit, and out of his leading strings. And these opinions are amply substantiated by what I have above said of our worthy ancestors, who never being be-preached and be-lectured, and guided and governed by statutes and laws and bylaws, as are their more enlightened descendants, did one and all demean themselves honestly and peaceably, out of pure ignorance, or, in other words, because they knew no better. Nor must I omit to record one of the earliest measures of this infant settlement, inasmuch as it shows the piety of our forefathers, and that, like good Christians, they were always ready to serve God, after they had first served themselves. Thus, having quietly settled themselves down, and provided for their own comfort, they bethought themselves of testifying their gratitude to the great and good Saint Nicholas, for his protecting care in guiding them to this delectable abode. To this end they built a fair and goodly chapel within the fort, which they consecrated to his name, whereupon he immediately took the town of New Amsterdam under his peculiar patronage, and he has even since been, and I devoutly hope will ever be, the tutelar saint of this excellent city. At this early period was instituted that pious ceremony, still religiously observed in all our ancient families of the right breed, of hanging up a stocking in the chimney on St. Nicholas Eve, which stocking is always found in the morning miraculously filled. For the good St. Nicholas has ever been a great giver of gifts, particularly to children. I am moreover told that there is a little legendary book somewhere extant, written in Low Dutch, which says that the image of this renowned saint, which whilom graced the bowsprit of the Goede Vrouw, was elevated in front of this chapel, in the center of what in modern days is called the Bowling Green, on the very spot, in fact, where he appeared in vision to aloft the dreamer. And the legend further treats of diverse miracles wrought by the mighty pipe which the saint held in his mouth, a whiff of which was a sovereign cure for an indigestion, an invaluable relic in this colony of brave trenchermen. As however, in spite of the most diligent search, I cannot lay my hands upon this little book, I must confess that I entertain considerable doubt on the subject. Thus benignly fostered by the good St. Nicholas, the infant city thrived apace. Hordes of painted savages, it is true, still lurked about the unsettled parts of the island. The hunter still pitched his bower of skins and bark beside the rills that ran through the cool and shady glens, while here and there might be seen, on some sunny knoll, a group of Indian wigwams whose smoke arose above the neighboring trees and floated in the transparent atmosphere. A mutual goodwill, however, existed between these wandering beings and the burghers of New Amsterdam. Our benevolent forefathers endeavored as much as possible to ameliorate their situation by giving them gin, rum, and glass beads in exchange for their peltries. For it seems the kind-hearted Dutchmen had conceived a great friendship for their savage neighbors, on account of their being pleasant men to trade with, and little skilled in the art of making a bargain. Now and then a crew of these half-human sons of the forest would make their appearance in the streets of New Amsterdam, fantastically painted and decorated with beads and flaunting feathers, sauntering about with an air of listless indifference. Sometimes in the marketplace, instructing the little Dutch boys in the use of the bow and arrow, at other times, inflamed with liquor, swaggering and whooping, and yelling about the town like so many fiends, to the great dismay of all the good wives, who would hurry their children into the house, fasten the doors, and throw water upon the enemy from the garret windows. It is worthy of mention here that our forefathers were very particular in holding up these wild men as excellent domestic examples, and for reasons that may be gathered from the history of Master Ogilby, who tells us that, for the least offense the bridegroom soundly beats his wife and turns her out of doors, and marries another, insomuch that some of them have every year a new wife. Whether this awful example had any influence or not history does not mention. But it is certain that our grandmothers were miracles of fidelity and obedience. True it is that the good understanding between our ancestors and their savage neighbors was liable to occasional interruptions, and I have heard my grandmother, who was a very wise old woman, and well versed in the history of these parts, tell a long story of a winter's evening, about a battle between the New Amsterdammers and the Indians, which was known by the name of the Peach War, and which took place near a peach orchard in a dark glen, which for a long while went by the name of Murderer's Valley. The legend of the Sylvan War was long current among the nurses, old wives, and other ancient chroniclers of the place. But time and improvement have almost obliterated both the tradition and the scene of battle, for what was once the blood-stained valley is now in the center of this populous city, and known by the name of Day Street. I know not whether it was to this Peach War, and the acquisitions of Indian land which may have grown out of it, that we may ascribe the first seeds of the spirit of annexation, which now began to manifest themselves. Hitherto the ambition of the worthy burghers had been confined to the lovely island of Mannahatta, and Spitten Devil on the Hudson and Hellgate on the Sound were to them the pillars of Hercules, the ne plus ultra of human enterprise. Shortly after the Peach War, however, a restless spirit was observed among the New Amsterdammers, who began to cast wistful looks upon the wild lands of their Indian neighbors. For somehow or other wild Indian land always looks greener in the eyes of settlers than the land they occupy. It is hinted that aloft the dreamer encouraged these notions, having, as has been shown, the inherent spirit of a land speculator, which had been wonderfully quickened and expanded since he had become a landholder. Many of the common people, who had never before owned a foot of land, now began to be discontented with the town lots which had fallen to their shares. Others who had snug farms and tobacco plantations found they had not sufficient elbow room, and began to question the rights of the Indians to the vast regions they pretended to hold, while the good aloft indulged in magnificent dreams of foreign conquest and great patroonships in the wilderness. The result of these dreams were certain exploring expeditions sent forth in various directions to sow the seeds of empire, as it was said. The earliest of these were conducted by Hans Rainier Uthout, an old navigator famous for the sharpness of his vision, who could see land when it was quite out of sight to ordinary mortals, and who had a spyglass covered with a bit of tarpaulin, with which he could spy up the crookedest river, quite to its headwaters. He was accompanied by Mynheer Ten Britches, as land measurer, in case of any dispute with the Indians. What was the consequence of these exploring expeditions? In a little while we find a frontier post or trading house called Fort Nassau, established far to the south on Delaware River, another called Fort Good Hope or Good Hope, on the Varsh or Fresh or Connecticut River, and another called Fort Oronea, now Albany, away up the Hudson River. While the boundaries of the province kept extending on every side, nobody knew whither, far into the regions of terra incognita. Of the boundary feuds and troubles which the ambitious little province brought upon itself by these indefinite expansions of its territory we shall treat at large in the after pages of this eventful history. Sufficient for the present is it to say that the swelling importance of the New Netherlands awakened the attention of the mother country, who, finding it likely to yield much revenue and no trouble, began to take that interest in its welfare which knowing people evince for rich relations. But as this opens a new era in the fortunes of New Amsterdam, I will here put an end to this second book of my history, and will treat of the maternal policy of the mother country in my next. The end. Dear listener, we close the pages on another tale, a journey through words, imagination, and emotion. Here at the Falls Audiobook, where stories flow like a river's current, carrying you to distant worlds and uncharted depths, we thank you for joining us. As always, we invite you to linger a little longer. Subscribe to our channel to discover more stories waiting to be heard, each a cascade of voices, ideas, and artistry. And remember, every great story begins with a single word. Perhaps the next one will begin with you. Until our voices meet again, may your days be filled with quiet moments, rich pages, and the soothing sound of a story well told. This is the Falls Audiobook, signing off.